Okay. Let us make sure everything is in good working order. Okay. Fantastic. I'm hearing sound on the live broadcast. Oh, look. You can actually see my face instead of from an angle that looks like I'm performing and talking to you rather than like I'm on a surveillance camera. Cool. Let's, I know we have a few guests of honor showing up. Let's go see.
Could you voice act in a slice of life?
Let us see how we are doing. All right. We're just waiting to say hello. Nothing yet, Carrie. You did not miss a thing. I'm waiting for Sarah. I know she's probably going out there to spread the word and telling people that I am live. And until such time as she arrives, you will have missed nothing. And if you stay for the duration of her being here, also, you will also miss nothing. So you'll get everything. I know. Hello. How are you doing? Hello, Facebook user. I can't see you. Whose name is that? All right. I think, yeah, we got 5 people here. I think we're good to get started. Good to see you all. All those new and returning, it is lovely to have you here with us today for this next installment of Alaskan Fury by the inimitable Sara King, narrated by me, but not in this accent, as that would be singularly inappropriate for the tone of the story. I'm not reading a Jane Austen novel. I'm not even sure they'd wanted you to narrate one of those. Anyway, here we go. After that really loud and bassy airplane passes by. My God! I get all that geared up, and then there's just a big, bassy background noise that's cutting right through the soundproofing on this thing. Isn't that fun? Oh, man. Thank you for the laugh emoji, Carrie. I'm glad my old-timey British aside was so entertaining for you. Oh, whoops. Vin, hello! How are you doing? Lawnmowers, well, for me, I live right near an airport, lucky me. And I also live right near a highway. It's honestly beyond amazing I am able to get as much done as I can during the day. I don't know what kind of luck I have or if the soundproofing on this thing is just that good. But, like, the fact that I can go uninterrupted for hours at a time and barely have to worry about the background noise is so nice. but also some of it does cut through. Particularly loud and bassy playing, motorcycle with a large enough engine, road construction. It can get through there, but okay. It's still out there. God, it's still making noise. Okay. Yes, unfortunately, that's the worst part, is nobody on the other end can hear it. But it's because it's such a low frequency sound. So what'll happen is the mic, as it broadcasts, ideally will cut that sound frequency out, like most of it. Because this, the preamp I pass my mic through is designed to cut out anything below 100 hertz, or it's set to do that right now. Because very little of the human voice, if any of it, aside from like just exceptionally deep voices, will not hit that range. But it's never exactly 100 hertz. So unfortunately, I can't cut it all out, and then a skilled engineer, which Sound Booth has in abundance, will be able to hear it. And when they try to maximize the volume so that it's nice and even and consistent, that sound will be brought out, and then I have to re-record the lines. And it's a big pain for everybody involved. And I hate it. Okay. I wonder if I can move this light over some more. Anyway. Okay. Now we're good. The sound is passed. I'm just going to wait to see if it's like someone out there going, okay, hold on. I think you pressed the button. All right, turn it back on. Turn it back on! It's like they know. That was like the dogs I used to live with at my parents' house. Like when I first started doing this, I was doing it from my parents' place, and they have a very loud, excitable, and territorial Doberman, and we have a park, or they had a park in their backyard, and that was his park. So anytime he even got an inkling that somebody was in said park, boy, did we all get an earful. Oh, look, it's back. See, I told you. Now it's back. This is the laugh of despair and insanity. Okay, I think I'm good. It's that laugh you do when if you don't laugh, all you'll do is just cry. It's getting quieter, so whatever it's doing is growing more distant. I think it's down at a volume where I can record now. Okay, we're good. Chapter 4. The Shifting of the Sands. Kashifa marched north along the fast gray waters of the Yentna River in a rage. She wasn't surprised by the Jinni's stubbornness, but still, it grated at her. Good people were going to die, bled for their magics by selfish, morally defunct, power-hungry oath-breakers. And here the Jinni was forcing her to trounce through... It was forcing her to trounce through the woods, Trebek. And here the Jinni was forcing her to trounce through the woods to make deals with serpents, when honor said they should resolve their problems between themselves for the good of it all. Akrab would pay for this with his life. Right after she gave him to the dragons for safekeeping. When the Jinni appeared before her again, the weak fall sun had dropped below the horizon, and its feeble rays had melted most of the frost on the round river stones beneath Kashifa's feet. Akrab arrived without warning. Akrab arrived. Akrab arrived without warning, as he always did, blocking her path like an obsidian statue.
You and I, the Jinni growled without preamble, need to come to an understanding, Fury.
Kashifa fought the immediate surge of panic at Akrab's sudden appearance, and recomposed herself quickly. While it frayed her nerves to stand her ground, she did not allow herself to retreat out of arm's reach of the massive beast. To do so would have admitted she was afraid of him, and she would rather die than have the Jinni witness her fear once again. Lifting her head in feigned arrogance, Kashifa sneered, "An understanding of what, beast? The terms of your death." His face tightened. His face tightened at the word beast, as it always had. But at least he didn't seem to recognize the fear thrumming through her veins, the same ancient terror that had been with her since the day she'd left her sword buried in the sands of an oasis, her hands burned to the bone from where its hilt had seared her skin.
"The terms of our arrangement, Mondib,"
he rumbled, his arms folded over his big chest.
"I would offer a bargain of sorts. First off, stop recording me in the chick track. And record me in the dude track, god damn it."
Okay. Kashifa laughed. "Bargain, Akrab. You think I have spent 3,000 years bound to a Jinni, and have not learned to avoid a fourth lander bargain at all costs?" He narrowed his violet eyes at her.
"I would remove my curse. You would be free to kill again, little wolf."
Kashifa's heart stopped. Never before had the Jinni offered the removal of his deathbed curse outside the context of a wish. A wish, of course, that both of them knew he would mangle just as thoroughly the first 2 times she'd wished it. Warily, she glanced back up at the Jinni. Somehow she sensed that this time Akrab was being truthful, and that thought left her heart suddenly slamming against her ribcage. The ability to kill again. It made her blood sing with hope. She had long ago given up any real optimism that he would ever willingly remove his deathbed curse, and that he was offering now, when she needed it most, left her both ecstatic and suspicious. Oh, sorry, I lost my place there. Okay. Got to move that into place. And there we go.
"And what would you want in return, Jinni?"
she asked, carefully keeping her excitement from her voice. Unfortunately, she couldn't kill the Jinni with just teeth and claws. Surely he knew that, which was probably the only reason he was offering.
"Relinquish your shadow," Akrab said, watching her closely. "Give up your ability to hurt me, Mondib. Do me that favor, and I will lift my curse."
This time, Kashifa did take a step backwards, automatically reaching for the Jinni's soul cord in her mind.
"You would leave me helpless against you. Helpless, Mondib," he snorted. "You carry the third lander."
My voice cracked. Mom, why are you calling me in the middle of work? Okay. Okay, anyway.
You carry the third lander wolf with you. And if you follow through with your scheme to pass me on to the dragons, you doubtless shall have your full glory returned to you after that. And the time between now and then? He shrugged. We'll come to an understanding. He lifted a hand, reaching out for her. You'll have to trust me. You cross dangerous sands, Akrab, she warned, preparing a fistful of shadow should she need to keep him at bay. He cocked his head at her, irritation flashing in his unnatural purple eyes as he dropped his hand. Why? Because I ask that you stop treating me as an animal. This time, he took a step towards her, anger lighting his face. Leaning down until their noses almost touched, he said too softly, I saved your life, little wolf. I spirited you from those who would have spent years draining your life blood from your veins. How did you repay me? You drowned me in shadow so deep I had trouble breathing. For hours! Fierceness glared back at her, spurring that inner terror to a crescendo. Show me some decency, Fury, and give me back my dignity. Keep your distance, slave, Kashifa babbled, fighting a growing surge of panic at his new persistence. She stepped back again. I am not a slave, Akrab snarled, stepping forward until their bodies again almost touched. Learn that. Unless you would like for me to begin addressing you as whore or slut. I am of noble birth, and I find it similarly offensive. Kashifa scrambled to once more put distance between them. I will keep it under advisement, she managed, scrambling to keep the obsidian mountain before her from seeing under her facade. He narrowed his eyes at her. Good. Now, relinquish your hold on the shadows. I tire of your punishments, Mondib. I've reached the point in my life where I can do without touching you if it truly bothers you for me to do so. I would be a complete fool to give you that boon, and we both know it, Kashifa blurted. The genie stepped closer again, oblivious to the way she grabbed his cord in a mental death grip. Like I said, Magus, he growled, his face much too close to hers. You and I are going to come to an understanding. Back up! Kashifa cried, panting, once more reluctantly ceding ground to the beast. I don't want to use shadows on you, Genie, but I then don't, Akrab interrupted, forcefully stepping forward again. Never had he been this brazenly adamant about anything, and it was scouring her chest in a wash of panic. Relinquish that power over me, and you shall be freed of my curse. On my honor, as a sand singer. His gaze was intense, demanding, passionate. Kashifa met his eyes, and for a breathless moment almost believed him. Then she remembered the first two wishes he had granted her. Morbid, twisted things that bore no resemblance to their original form. And she shook herself. You spin your words like a weaver's thread, cutting and twisting them to suit your own needs. I'm too old to be making bargains with Jinn. Old you may be, but not wise. I'm offering a truce, Megas. The dragons may be able to remove the third lander, but I'm the only one who can lift my deathbed curse. What good will it do you to gain your wings if you still can't wield your sword? Kashifa peered up at him haughtily, trying to hide the way her knees tried to collapse beneath his stare. And why, she said, searching his eyes in challenge, would the genie wish I give up my ability to punish him unless he planned to misbehave? The genie's lips quirked in an impish smile. I suppose you'll have to find out, won't you, little wolf? I know what you want, and you will never have it, not from me. He returned her stare with fierceness. Then the Fury is afraid. Yes, she thought, miserable. Of course I'm not afraid. Then what can you lose with granting me this boon? Everything! Her mind screamed. her entry to the temple, her sisterhood, her sword. Unable to answer under the Jinni's passion, she bit her lip and looked away. After a long moment, the Jinni sighed and gestured at the forest around them. Feel the forest, Mondib? It's fading. The Inquisitors have taken every moon-kissed, fae, and other kin for miles. I might find it necessary to take you to the Firelands again, in order to rescue your ungrateful hide, and I will not suffer your shadows a second time for helping you. Kashifa snorted. Or perhaps you intend to kill me, and end your imprisonment here. The Jinni cocked his head down at her. If that were my goal, I would have done so last night, when I had you helpless at my feet, begging me for death. Kashifa's face heated with shame, and she looked away, hating to be reminded of the fact. She, a maiden of the sword, had begged a man to kill her. It was unspeakable. So, Akrab said, watching her carefully. With that in mind, let's cease being unreasonable. You were willing to die last night. Now I'm offering you a truce instead. The dragons can remove the third lander, but as the one who cursed you at the oasis, only I can return to you your ability to kill. I'll give it back, if you will relinquish your damned shadows. I've spent too long swallowing your poisons, Mondib. It is icing over my soul. He gave her a mirthless smile. Just as I would imagine my deathbed wish has been drying out yours. Kashifa swallowed, hard. She glanced down the river, watching the chunks of ice floating downstream, knocked loose by the weak sunlight from where they had frozen in ponds or along stream beds overnight. It was true. His curse had been wearing on her for millennia. She couldn't even kill a rabbit, not even to save herself from starving. She had wandered the herds of the savannah for months, praying to find the maggot-ridden carcass of a lion's kill upon which to feed, living until her arms and legs became spindly bones, her ribs like fingers jutting from her chest, yet unable to die. So many times it had happened. Africa, Asia, India, the Americas. A fury, if she was to die, had to die a violent death. Her blood had to be spilled completely. Starvation, while utterly wretched and mind-destroying, could never kill her. What was worse, each time her body had dwindled to bones, the Jinni, while he himself never needed to eat as anything more than curiosity or luxury, suddenly claimed he craved red meat, and spent a few days harnessing the power of the Fourth Lands to craft himself vast meals, much more than he could ever eat, and then, once satisfying this newfound craving, idly disappeared to allow her to eat his leavings. A couple times, when Akrab had exhausted his supply of Fourthlander magics and still the Third Lander hungered, he had even killed for her. Something she had learned over the years a Jinni despised almost as much as water. Even back then, gazing upon that first mountain of food, Kashifa knew Akrab had been taking pity on her. The humiliation still wormed holes through her soul. She, a fury, had been forced to eat the leftovers of a man in order to survive. Even knowing it, however, she hadn't been able to bring herself to refuse his offerings. It had been one of many occasions where her stomach had overpowered her pride, spurned by the voracious, undeniable appetite of the Third Lander infecting her blood. Dragging her eyes from the chunks of ice floating upon the river, Kashifa looked back up at Akrab, who watched her all too carefully over the massive arms he'd crossed over his smooth ebony chest. The Jinni wanted her. She had seen it, blazing in his eyes as he challenged her time and again. Half of her worried that this was a ploy to further her corruption, to rip away the last of her defenses so he could finish his defilement of her. The other half of her recognized that this was the first time the Jinni had so much as mentioned returning her sword to her, and she knew that if she didn't accept his offer now, she was probably going to have to wait another 3,000 years before he deigned to make it again. I've seen your need. You can't tell me you won't touch me, Jinni. I've seen you desire me. Even with the threat of shadows, you pollute me at every opportunity. If you lift your curse, I may be able to kill, but no amount of third lander, tooth or claw can kill a Jinni, Akrab. I am not a fool. He flinched, and for a moment it looked as if he would simply flicker back to the Firelands, his game forfeit. Stiffly leaning against a fallen tree, however, he reluctantly agreed. That much is true. When you are not being a Kiba, I've wanted you very much. Yes. He shrugged. After all, when one is trapped with no other soul in sight for decades on end, one gets desperate. His casual shrug was belied by the way he was scuffing his toe in the gravel, concentrating on anything but her face. His obvious discomfort giving her the strength she needed to continue, she ventured. The girls I've spoken to that you've taken to a room with you, the wolves and before them the harlots and the whores. Everywhere we go, they say you cannot bed them when the time comes for the act. Is this true? He reddened, his body becoming rigid under her appraisal. He cleared his throat, glancing at his feet. It's true. A Jinni cannot lie, she thought, stunned. While he could twist words to suit him, they always had to be true by Fourthlander law, or he would forfeit his power as a Jinni. Why? She demanded. The Jinni moved gravel with his toes, digging them under the sand. It took him a moment to say, Let it suffice to say, I made a wish for myself as a young fool. What kind of wish? She asked warily. He lifted his violet eyes to glare at her. This stupid kind. So you can't bed women? She asked, biting her lip against hope. I can't bed women. Not that it's any of your business, Mondib. A Jinni could not lie, and Kashifa could not see how he could twist those particular words. Immediately she wondered what kind of curse a Jinni could put on himself to leave him with such a fate. Then, she frowned, you bed men? I can bed men, Akrab agreed reluctantly. The words sounded as if they'd been dragged from his throat by a hyena. But not women, Kashifa insisted, just to make sure. I can't bed women. How many times must I say it? He almost sounded irritated that the words were coming from his throat, almost as if he hadn't expected them to be true. He couldn't spear her. He couldn't break her maidenhead. The knowledge was so utterly relieving to her that Kashifa slumped back against the fallen spruce behind her, suddenly needing to sit down. All this time, you let me believe, she began, as her eyes darted unwillingly towards the silk covering his groin before she dragged them away again. You were just being cruel. The fact remains, I can't bed women. And with your last wish still binding us, you have nothing to fear of me. Thus, free me of your damned shadows, Mondib. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm more afraid of you touching me. Irritation flashed in the Jinni's violet eyes. I told you, I reached the point in my life where I could avoid touching you if necessary. Yet you haven't told me you won't touch me. Of course I won't tell you that. Then what will I do if I need to save you again? You would have me take the time to swaddle you in cloth to avoid contacting you with my skin? He gave a derisive snort and reached down to grab a pebble and toss it into the silty gray Yentna River. That would be preferable, Kashifa muttered, remembering the way her skin had broiled. Still, in comparison to hanging from an inquisitor's rack, her blood draining into a basin at her feet, she supposed it had been a small price to pay. "Forgive me if I didn't take the time to swaddle you before I rescued you," Akrab growled, glancing at her. "You've heard my offer, Mondib. Your sword for your shadows. I'm not going to make it again." Still, Kashifa hesitated, her eyes once more falling unbidden to the filth at his groin. She had the sudden need to delve further into the Jinni's latest revelation, to find the core of the matter. "This wish of yours, it was to never bed another woman?" Akrab paused in plucking another pebble from the beach and hesitated, staring down at the sand for several breaths before he stood up to face her. Kashifa had learned that the genie always made such pauses when he was about to weave words, and even as he opened his mouth to lie to her, she lifted a hand. "Never mind, Jinni. I will not hear your twisted truths. What you did to curse yourself is your own business. Lift your deathbed curse from my shoulders. Give me the ability to defend myself once more, and I will relinquish my hold on the shadows." Mouth still open, mid-lie, the Jinni gave her a narrow look. "Very well. Let us make it official. Wrap it in law." Even then, his eyes began to glow a stark violet against the dying light. "No!" Kashifa snarled. Immediately, the Jinni's eyes lost their luminescence. He frowned at her. "No. No. I've spent too long watching you spin your words to allow you to wind me into another of your spells, Jinni. We will do this as adults." He gave her an irritated look. "The last time you mentioned dealing with each other as adults, Mondib, you were telling me you wanted to cut off my head." "First," Kashifa said, ignoring him, "you will revoke your curse and return me to my ability to kill. Only then will I surrender my hold on the shadows." The Jinni raised his eyebrows and laughed. "You want me to trust you? One of us will have to go first, and considering the way you Oh, hell yeah, I made it through a loop brace. Sick! And considering the way you wove my... And considering the way you wove my last two wishes into oblivion, I am certainly not going to trust you." The Jinni wrinkled his nose as if he smelled something foul. "It is not my fault you left gaping holes in your request. You intentionally put them there. You know exactly what I wanted." He glared at her. "You wanted the ability to kill me, Mondib. I wanted the same thing you're offering now. What gives me any assurance you are not once again twisting your words to suit you? Because I offered it! It's a gift, you unlovable sand mite!" Kashifa shrugged. "Then let it be a gift. That is my counteroffer. You go first, you trust me. Then I will return the favor." He blinked at her, obviously realizing his own mistake. For a moment he only stared at her in silence. "And if you don't? If you simply take my gift and don't reciprocate, I've lost my only real bargaining chip in all of this." "I think that you are running out of options, Jinni." She glanced north, upriver. "Somewhere up there, I am going to find a dragon who would love to get his talons on a Jinni. If I am not freed of my curses by then, he might just get it." "Might." Kashifa shrugged. "With this many missing, the Inquisitors are taking them somewhere large, a compound of some sort. Close, because it would be difficult to smuggle them out of state. I might need a bargaining chip to gain the dragon's help in an assault, if I must use my blood debt to remove the Third Lander possession from my veins." For some time, the Jinni only scowled at her. Finally, though, he muttered, "I can't speak until this very loud thing passes by and stops ruining the audio," is what I muttered. God damn it. "Hold on."
Giving that a minute. Giving that a minute. Giving that a minute to pass by. Beautiful. Okay.
We might be able to work something out, Mondib. Immediately, Kashifa's suspicions surged. Never had the Jinni been this willing to cooperate, and it was setting off her every internal alarm. You have never been this complacent before, Akrab. What is your game? The Jinni gave her a fierce look. The events of the past day and a half have forced me to look at things in a different light. What kind of light? She asked, wariness building. The compromising kind. Do you swear to me you will relinquish your shadow if I lift my curse? I want an oath on your lord's pendant. Kashifa's hand immediately went to the winged sword at her neck in horror. Absolutely not! She was not about to profane her symbol with an oath of concession to a male. He narrowed his eyes at her. And yet you expect me to believe you will fulfill your half of the bargain. It's not a bargain, Kashifa reminded him, all too careful not to mince words with a Jinni, lest he mistake her words for agreement to his bargain. You said so yourself. We are gifting each other something the other desires. There is no bargain involved. The Jinni made a disgusted sound and turned on heel, his bare feet crunching against gravel as he strode down the riverbank, leaving her alone. Realizing he was headed north towards the dragons, Kashifa unconcernedly began to follow him. In face of the Jinni's stubbornness, it would be many weeks before she could help the Phoenix, especially with winter fast approaching. The snow in the mountains could sometimes get over 10 feet deep, and the hundreds of miles of forest and riverlands between Squentna and the Brooks Range would be rough and treacherous going. Fallen trees, tangles of brush, thin ice, and swaths of Devil's Club made the woodlands a hazardous, painful trek, even without snow to hide its obstacles from the surface. The cold, too, would be difficult to withstand, even with her shields to shelter her. Temperatures in interior Alaska often dropped to more than -40 degrees Fahrenheit during the darkest parts of winter, and Kashifa's coats and winter gear had all been destroyed by the Inquisitors. Kashifa just hoped she could reach the dragons in time. A few hundred feet up the river, the Jinni twisted back on her suddenly, his eyes aglow. Before she could pull away, Akrab reached out like a viper and grabbed her by the arm. His voice a concussive, triple-toned thunder powered by the magic of the Fourth Lands. He boomed, "Very well, Kashifa, Maiden of the Sword, Angel of Vengeance, Ernius of Grecian lore. I hereby lift the curse I made upon my knees at the oasis of Tafalat." Even as Kashifa was flinching backwards from the Jinni's touch, she felt the ancient weave that Akrab had long ago knotted around her soul unravel and fall away. Kashifa gasped as that part of her mind unlocked once more, opening and stretching like a long-closed flower, granting her sudden and complete access to a wide range of thoughts that she had spent 3,000 years trying to forget. Akrab released her brusquely as his eyes lost their luminescence. "It is done. You are able to kill, Mondib." She saw fear mingling with the scorn in his face as he waited an arm's length away, watching her in silence. Kashifa glanced down at her hands. They were shaking. Gingerly, she reached down and pried a stick from the frosty sands along the beach, then hefted it. She felt nothing preventing her from swinging it at the Jinni's head, no threat of fire tingling her palms. To test her theory, she swung, stopping the stick just centimeters from the Jinni's brow. She received no burns, no tingles of warning. Realizing that the Jinni had actually done as he offered, without catches, or caveats, or snares, Kashifa stared up at him, stunned beyond words. Unflinching, Akrab peered impassively down at her past the stick. And now that the Jinni has played his last card, like a fool, it is the Fury's move. Yet even under his aloof facade, she could see his fear. It burned within him, like the fires of a forge, lighting his eyes well after the Fourthlander magics had faded. Kashifa lowered her stick, her heart beginning to thunder. Standing like an ebony mountain above her, Akrab held her gaze for long minutes, waiting. He had given her his gift. Now he was waiting to see if she would gift him something in return. He wants me to give him my shadows. The thought brought a whole new wave of terrors to the forefront of her mind, a whole new wave of suspicions. Why does he want me to give up my shadows? What could be so important to him that he gave her? Oh, wait. That's a thought. What could be so important to him? Oh, wait, god damn it. I'm narrating and I was having a problem with this yesterday. What could be so important to him that he gave her this? Mondib, the Jinni urged softly, a gentle plea. I'm so tired of this struggle. Will you return the gift? She looked into his eyes and saw sincerity in his face. He'd played his last card, and he knew it. When Kashifa bit her lip and hesitated, however, she saw the openness to his face break, saw it twist in pain, saw his hopes crumble. The Jinni made a weary, disgusted sound and turned away. With a feral snarl, he ripped a hole in the veil between realms, and Kashifa had to stumble back against the blast of heat as he prepared to depart for the Firelands, likely for good. Which is what she'd wanted, right? He trusted you, Fury, she thought, guilt hitting her like a blow. If there was one thing a Fury would die for, it was her word, her honor. Wait! 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 I need that to be more of a ragged whisper. Wait! It was a ragged whisper in her throat, but it was enough to make the Jinni hesitate. He slowly turned to face her, anger in his face, his body blocking the heat from the portal between realms. What now, Fury? He sneered, his words filled with bitterness, his eyes dark with the hurt of betrayal. You would have me remove the third lander as well. Steeling herself, Kashifa harnessed the wolf just enough to force canines through her jaw, then bit a ragged tear into her palm. Her adrenaline thrumming with the horror of what she was about to do, she reached out and placed her hand upon the corded muscles of the Jinni's forearm. When he flinched, frowning down at the first time she had willingly touched him in 3,000 years, she reached for her awareness of the shadows. She started balling them up, wrapping her conscious perception of them into the blood that now oozed from her palm. Then, channeling the third lander again, she forced a claw into the Jinni's flesh and tore a hole in the skin of his arm. As the Jinni hissed and tried to yank his arm away, she held him in place with the strength of her third lander demon as she ran her palm over the wound, pushing her blood into his body. Harnessing the ancient language of the Furies, she forced through a fear-tightened throat. By my blood, I gift this Jinni my mastery of the shadows, until such time as he gifts it back. It was a simple wartime trick of her order, one usually performed by shieldmates or sword sisters, or other beings that trusted each other implicitly. Here she Had to make do. An instant later, she felt her awareness shift, felt a trickle of her energy sliding away, down her arm and into the Jinni. At the same time, the Jinni gasped above her, his black forearm stiffening under her like iron. Then, as if a light had been switched off in her mind, the world lost part of its depth, and Kashifa could no longer sense the shadows. She could still see them, but her mental command of them had simply ceased. Suddenly, quite thoroughly, she had left herself defenseless. "Oh, gods above me," she thought, staring at her tawny fingers, light against the jet of the Jinni's arm. "What have I done?" Her pulse was suddenly a rushing thunder in her ears. Her lungs... Oh, wait, what the hell? Her pulse was suddenly a rushing thunder in her ears, her lungs unable to get enough air. She heard him let out an unsteady breath, and her heart became a thunderous pounding in her chest, 1,000 hammers from Hephaestus's forge slamming against her ribs. For a long time she stared at where her small hand touched the Jinni's big forearm, wishing she could take it back. "Gods," she heard him say, a strangled sound. She slowly pulled her fingers back, too afraid to look up at him, too horrified to retreat to the river to begin her ablutions. He moved away from the portal to the Firelands. Then, and Kashifa... Firelands then, that's screwed up the emphasis there. He moved away from the portal to the Firelands then, and Kashifa took a step back, automatically, panic rising like pangs of acid through her veins. Only afterward did she realize her mistake. She, a sword maiden, had retreated. It was all the excuse the Jinni needed to step closer, until his chest almost brushed hers. Without her usual methods to deter him, Kashifa kept her head down, fighting despair. "He's going to touch me," she thought, miserable. Already she could feel his taint in the wound of her hand, a throbbing ache as blood dribbled from her clenched fist to the frozen pebbles at her feet. She looked away, biting back tears. In her periphery, the Jinni fell to one knee before her. "Mondeeb." It was a whisper. At least he wasn't defiling her with a touch. Daring to lift her head to meet his gaze, she was stunned to see utter, open-faced gratitude in the Jinni's eyes. Still, she was not prepared for the Jinni to grab her, to heft her body against his chest and tighten his arms around her, lifting her until her feet dangled as he laughed. "Oh, Mondeeb! Mondeeb!" He kissed her then, even as she tried to twist away, pressing his lips to her cheek, her chin, her forehead, her ear. "Enough!" she cried, struggling to pull herself from the iron bars that were his grip. "You dirty me with your touch, Akrab!" But the Jinni just held on, his naked skin hot against hers like a rock that had been left too long in a fire, pulling her so tight to his massive chest that she began to have trouble breathing. He dropped his head to her shoulder and laughed against her neck until his breaths devolved into something that sounded like sobs. It was the pathetic wrenching of his chest against hers that stopped her struggles and made her stare. He was as miserable as I was, Kashifa realized, stunned. She had always thought his nasty quips and constant barbs to be an indication of his innate malice. But she began to wonder if perhaps she had read him wrong. If, perhaps, he had simply been weaving his spite as a tapestry to hide his despair. The Jinni held her for what felt like hours, until they had both gone silent, and the Jinni was simply releasing slow, easy breaths against her shoulder. His extra body warmth, that which came from being a demon of the flame, was enough even to overwhelm the dirty feel of their skin contacting, the corruption of a male touching a warrior priestess of Horus. "Enough, Akrab," she finally whispered. You defile me. She felt the Jinni's grip harden around her, and for a moment she thought he would ignore her and try to continue the hold. Then, reluctantly, the Jinni pulled away and wiped his face on a big arm. He caught her eyes for a moment, and there was pain etching the tears on his cheeks. An embrace doesn't defile, little wolf. It does if it comes from a man. You know what I am, Jinni. Respect that for once. As it was, she would have to spend hours in prayer to rid herself of his taint. Akrab continued to meet her eyes, his gaze fierce. And you know what I am, little wolf. I am no ice maiden. I have gone 3 millennia craving the human touch. Humor me. She felt her lips twist to tell him she'd rather roll in the filth of swine than, at the desperation in his face. She felt her lips twist to tell him she'd rather roll in the filth of swine than, at the desperation in his face. She felt her lips twist to tell him she'd rather roll in the filth of swine than, at the desperation in his face, hesitated. By gifting him her shadows, she had accepted his truce. Only now was she learning the terms. He couldn't spear her, but he still wanted her. It was as clear as the color of the sun. Kashifa glanced down at his big black hands and considered whether she would ever be allowed inside the temples again. To allow him to continue to touch her. That she was even considering it left her in despair. 3,000 years had truly worn on her. For a moment there was nothing to break the silence, except for the sound of her blood, dripping a near black against the frosty stones. She watched the Jinni look down at the deeper darkness of her blood against the pebbled beach. He frowned, thankfully twisting the conversation from its former direction. "Let me see," he commanded, holding out a big hand. Though Kashifa would rather put her hand into Hephaestus's furnace than into a Jinni's palm, she reluctantly did as she was asked. Knowing she could no longer cow him with shadows took much of her well-cultured disdain from her facade, while at the same time his boon gave her the confidence to hold steady. While still unable to take her birthright form, she was once again a Fury in spirit. And a Fury feared no man. Akrab took her hand gently. Once she had opened her fist for him to see, the Jinni tisked and stroked an ebony thumb across the wound. As he did, she felt the tear she had given herself with the Third Lander's teeth sealing under his touch, the cool, prickly sensation leaving her with a ragged pink scar. Akrab held her hand much longer than necessary, and eventually Kashifa raised her head to look at him. 3,000 years, Mondib. Even in the dying light she could see the tears brimming in his eyes. In 3,000 years, you've never willingly held out your hand to me.
Jesus. Don't you love when you swallow dust?
Uncomfortable all over again. Kashifa... damn it. Uncomfortable all over again. Kashifa tried to pull away, but Akrab held her firmly. In a whisper, he added, "Yet, you do it twice in one night. You said you need not touch me," Kashifa growled, trying not to imagine the taint that was even then seeping into her being. "I'm a Jinni, Mondib," he offered softly, his gaze locked to hers. "Passion is in my blood." Unnerved by the sudden change in the conversation's direction, she quickly growled, Your self-made wishes are none of my affair. You cursed yourself to celibacy. It is not my responsibility to console you for your stupidity when you so flagrantly use others' words against them every chance you get. You said you could do without my touch, then do so. She jerked her arm in an attempt to free herself of the Jinni's grip, but he simply held fast. Mondib, Akrab said softly. Tell me, will you let me touch you again? Your healing is appreciated, Jinni. Now release my hand before I rip it off! She twisted, intending to walk past him, but he failed to release her. Behind her, the Jinni moved on his knees to face her, and whispered, Mondib. Realizing he wasn't going to release her, Kashifa's heart started hammering with brutal force as she reluctantly turned back to once again meet his eyes. The Jinni's raw need was there, utterly exposed for her to see, his soul bared and vulnerable. She knew she could have hurt him then, could have scored him with her words until he never thought of defiling her body again, and forever kept his distance. Instead, however, she found herself lost in his gaze, wrenched to the very core by his inner fire. Please, he whispered, still holding her. She found she could say nothing, could only stare at him like a rabbit caught in a hunter's snare. 1,000 things raced through her mind, but she could no more force them from her throat than she could wrench her hand from the Jinni's grasp. Still kneeling, the Jinni leaned forward and reached up with his free hand to touch the back of her head. She felt his body slide closer, like a warm cocoon to shelter her from the cold, and heard his heart hammering like thunder in his chest. Too late, Kashifa saw the ardor in the Jinni's eyes, and realized his big, hot palm was slipping against her scalp, steadying her head as he brought his face to meet hers. The tree beside her head exploded in a blast of bark and wood chips, followed by the booming retort of a high-powered rifle echoing across the river. Snapped from her paralysis, Kashifa instinctively threw the third lander from his cage and used him to power her limbs as she shifted to wolf and ran. The Jinni likewise twisted to the fourth lance. On the river, a boat filled with black-clad men and women roared from its hidden niche across the water. Nearby, black shadows moved low and fast through the trees, murmuring orders into little microphones against their throats. More gunfire slammed into the cranberry and currant bushes as Kashifa lunged the riverbank and bolted. She felt one hit her hip, felt the silver start paralyzing the third lander there, and surrounded it with her magic, forcing the corruptive heat of the silver back to the bullet. "Silver's not working!" Sorry, just another noise.
Voices again. Let's grab those voices one more time. I need to meld that in Zenata.
Okay. "Silver's not working!" she heard someone hiss from behind her. "The damn wolf is getting away!" With her senses now receiving the full benefit of the third lander in her blood, she heard the strange, soft whisper of, "It's the demon we're after, Imelda. Figure out how the wolf is controlling it." There were too many of them, Kashifa realized, veering suddenly to the left when she saw more of the black-clad soldiers moving through the brush ahead of her. Dozens, maybe even hundreds. She banked hard and dove into the deeper forest between two startled black shapes. "Yellow-bellied bitch ain't even fighting," a man with a Texan accent laughed. "Running like a scared rabbit." The sounds of gunfire followed his words, and little bursts of shredded moss exploded in little thumps around her feet. Another bullet hit her, this time in the back leg. Kashifa gasped and stumbled, rolling through the brush to slam into the base of a birch tree hard enough to knock the wind out of her. "They've got me," Kashifa thought, too dazed to make her body move as the men came to a running halt behind her and raised their rifles. Then, suddenly, a blast of fire between them lit up the darkness, half blinding her with its intensity. Men screamed and backed away as a massive spruce tree burst into flames from the Jinni's heat, its resins lighting up the night for hundreds of yards. The air was suddenly awash with a frenzied static of screams and orders. Nearby, someone shouted, "Get it in the open! Fire! Fire!" But the Jinni had already slipped back to the fourth realm, leaving nothing but a roaring column of flames in his wake. "He keeps slipping realms," a black-clad woman was saying. "He must be tied to something here." "Figure out what it is and bring it back, Imelda, or a report of your incompetence will reach the Inquisidor Grande," the whisper replied. "The wolf is wearing something around her neck," one of the black-clad warriors said into the mic as she closed in on Kashifa's position. "A talisman of some sort." "The wolf is wearing something around her neck," one of the black-clad warriors said into the mic as she closed in on Kashifa's position. "A talisman of some sort." It was the tall brunette in jeans, Kashifa realized, the one who had thrown the dart to take down the werverine. The Spaniard. "Kill the wolf and bring back the talisman for the Great Commission to evaluate," the whisper snapped back, "and be quick about it. This place is crawling with other kin. Jacob found another knot of them a few miles downriver." Kashifa was already crawling back to her feet, blotting out the pain, narrowing her attention to speed. Overhead, she heard an odd thrumming sound and looked up just in time to see a helicopter, sleek, bullet-shaped, almost completely silent, unlike any helicopter she'd ever seen before, sliding overhead. Behind her, the women in black made no effort to follow. "Got the wolf on infrared. Jinni is nearby, 50 feet south-southwest of your position. Fucker lights up like a flashlight. He's circling to the wolf." "Ground crew clear," Kashifa heard the Spaniard say. "Make it rain." Make it rain? And suddenly the world began to flare and explode with heavy gunfire. Kashifa threw up a defensive wall around her just at the last moment, stopping liquid-oozing bullets in a hazy bubble of shield magic. She threw energy to her wounds, sealing off the silver to the best of her ability, and then bolted. She knew that she would quickly outpace the Jinni, but his soul bond would not allow him to be more than 500 cubits distant, so he would simply be dragged by their link until she slowed enough for him to walk. She hoped he had the good sense to flip back to the fourth realm, even though she wasn't about to slow down long enough to find out. She ran, weaving a barrier of invisibility through the lair protecting her from the bullets, until it was difficult to see through the shimmery blur that she had created. "What the fuck just happened?" someone snapped with a French accent. "The wolf vanished off the sensors." "You missed, you fucktard," a man with a German accent snapped. "She just bolted, beeline through the trees. No way we're going to catch her now." "That was a direct hit. No freaking way we missed that. She's not even showing up on our cameras." And then Kashifa wrapped herself in a capsule of magic and shunted herself to a stream she remembered fishing at several miles upriver from the sleeping lady, where salmon settled to rest on their long journey up the Yentna. A crab would not like it. He never did enjoy the way the bond wrenched him around during her void walks, but she was pretty sure that this time he was not going to object. Blackness swallowed her suddenly, yanking her out of range of her enemy's whispers and heartbeats, leaving her hearing nothing but the sound of her own breath in her lungs. The blackness was complete, except for a blinding blue-white electric cable between her and her destination. There were other cables, if she looked too closely, billions of cables, all bending and twisting, threatening to tangle her thoughts and trap her if she examined them for long. But the one she needed was close at hand. It was also one of the few she could actually reach, as exhausted and injured as she was. Saying a mental prayer, she grabbed it and yanked. A few minutes later, she spilled out onto the cold, half-frozen surface of Carboy Creek, then, with the sudden, unpleasant sound of breaking glass, fell through the ice into the creek itself. The frigid water hit her body in a sudden wave of shocking cold, and Kashifa sucked in a huge gasp of air, struggling to get a hold on the wafer-thin sheet that had held her. Chunks of ice broke off easily in her fingers, giving her no purchase to pull herself from the water. As she panicked at the center of the creek, her body slipping almost instantly into a numb paralysis, the wolf within screamed and ranted against its cage, chipping at the walls she had used to confine it. "Can't use the wolf," she thought, desperate now. She had already used it too much that day, and she knew the more she let it from its cage, the stronger it became. She conceded to weave the spell of levitation around her legs, as she clung to the ice, feeling her body go numb as she concocted the platform to lift herself from the icy water. With the energy she had expended and the wounds she had endured, it took several minutes longer than it should have, and by the time she buoyed herself out of the creek and slumped to the ground on the opposite side, her body was numb with cold, and it convulsed with feral shivers. "Have to light a fire," she thought, realizing that the numbness spreading into her mind was being aided along by the icy fall air. She twisted slowly, looking at the nearby shore, seeking a likely source of fuel. Clumps of frozen marsh grasses were all that stood nearby. Deciding they would have to do, she crawled towards them and focused on them with her mind, narrowing what remained of her energy to a tight ball, heating the likeliest clump of frozen green grass into a timid flame. A timid flame which quickly went out. While immortal, given the right conditions, a Fury could die a violent death just as any other denizen of the First Realm. And Kashifa had been shot. Her life's blood was even then spilling out upon the ground beneath her, dark against the frozen silt of the riverbed. Deciding she needed to use the last of her reserves to stop the flow, she concentrated on sealing the wounds that the Inquisitors had given her, and left the fire for later. It took much too long to gain enough focus to fuse the flesh over the bullets, and by the time she was finished, the cold air had sapped the rest of her strength, leaving her with the odd feeling of numb, pleasant warmth. Groaning, Kashifa slumped to the frozen silt of the creek's swampy bank in a bed of frosty grass. After a few minutes of lying there, she saw the air shimmer near her head. "Did you have to walk the void? I've told you I despise being dragged through that tangled—" He stopped, peering down at her oddly. "Why are you wet?" Immediately, his eyes lifted to the jagged hole in the ice of Carboy Creek, following the trail of water back to where she lay. Kashifa's body now only suffered mild shivers, and she felt the nagging urge to close her eyes. Exhaustion finally setting in. She had expended much of her energy just trying to survive the jaunt through the Fourth Lands, and after a blood right with the Jinni and exhausting herself controlling the Third Lander in her blood, followed by a void walk, she was teetering on the edge of consciousness. And now, she carried 2 lumps of silver-like cysts under the skin, weeping poison into her system in hot waves, aggravating the Third Lander, making him even more frenzied at the back of her mind. Yet through it all, it had never even occurred to her to use the Jinni's boon to kill. Too long had she been bound by the Jinni's curse. Too long had she been bound by the Jinni's curse, she realized in tired disgust. Running, it seemed, had become second nature to her. Akrab fell into a kneeling position beside her, a black mountain in the darkness, and the heat intensified, suddenly warming her face and side. I see blood, but no wounds, Mondib, he said, concern in his violet eyes. How many times did they hit you? Kashifa tried to tell him, but her words must not have been loud enough, for the Jinni grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently. Mondib. His voice was a warning, but there was panic in his eyes. How many times and where? Just let me sleep, Kashifa said, and closed her eyes again. This time she was blessedly lost to the void before he could wake her again.
Whew. Crazy. Good stuff. Good stuff, good stuff. Oh, there I am. Thank you. No, when I do the cold reads, I don't go on Discord. I suppose I could. I don't think it would choke my bandwidth too much. Oh, man. Well, if all the chapters are around that length, we'll probably do at least 2 more of them. Let me just grab some water. How's everyone doing? Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I think I need to make that bullet read more startling.
Yeah, Akrab's voice is roughly around here. It should be, anyway.
I can go a bit deeper with it, but yeah. Thank you. Oh, man. Yeah, of course it is. It always is. At least as far as Akrab is concerned. He is 7 feet tall. Yes, he's a huge man. He's a very, very large man. Wow. It's a good thing there's a Starbucks next door to my house, man. Yeah, we're gonna we'll go through and they'll go through and add that during the polishing phase. That's gonna be something that will be. I marked it as I was reading, so that'll be something that'll have some kind of mystic reverb effect on it. So that'll be very, very good. Okay. Man, let me get some air in here real quick. It is hot. Turn those fans on. Wearing long sleeves probably doesn't help. That was probably a real stupid idea. Yeah, long sleeves in a closed space lined with insulating foam in summer. You're doing so. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. That's smart, Zach. Do that. It's so much fun to read your work. I love it. I really do. Am I okay? I'm just hot. I've been in here quite a bit because I don't know if you've seen, but I've been trying to up my social media presence, so I'm posting a ton of videos online, so I spend a lot of time in here. So the airflow just is not always great. That's all right. Thank you. Yeah, I always love this. This is always something for me to look forward to. Whew. All right, let me just give that another minute or two just to blow some air out of here. And then, No. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it as much as you are. It's just, you know, physical limitations of my own body can be a pain in the ass sometimes. I wish I didn't have those. Yeah. Remember to, yes, hit like. And check out, there's Cold Reads of Alaskan Fire are actually already on the Soundbooth Theater app, and that book is close to coming out now, by the way. Like, all of the proofing on that is done. They're polishing it right now, and they're through, yes, dance, entertain us, so, I don't know, I'll do that. If you want to see me, there's actually a video on my TikTok where I dance, if you want to see me dancing. It's profoundly awkward. But yeah, the book is in the polishing phase right now. I think they just polished, because each set's about 3 to 5 hours long. I think they finished polishing about, God, I want to say 8 hours of it, and we barely have any retakes left. So the polishers aren't finding a lot they need us to retake, which is great, very, very great. So it'll be out pretty fast. And then I also have Behind Blue Eyes coming out. We're actually working on turning that one into that one has a musical score. That'll be fun. But yeah, lots of stuff coming out. And then of course I'm going to I'll probably be talking about this book a lot on Soundbooth Theater Live next too. Isn't it cool? Yeah, I'm so excited for this one. But I'll be talking about Alaskan Fire's release a lot. I think in about 2 weeks, whenever they have the next podcast. Because they do it every couple of weeks. So, yes. Get it. It will be great. It is very good. I've heard Emma's performance as Blaze, and she did a very nice job. And then, of course, this one, we'd be bringing Annie back. She'll be Imelda and Zenaida. Okay, so I think I can feel the temperature start to drop slightly, but I'm sure you can hear those fans. I can't record with those on. God, I wish, right? I should start doing that thing other voice actors do. A lot of them, when they're in their booth, they will strap. Yes. Oh, the new cheese game. God, that was ridiculous. I got to do a very bad Invader Zim impression though. That was a lot of fun. So Invader Zim is one of my absolute favorite cartoons ever. Yeah, they strap ice. They strap like a bag of ice or a pack of ice to the back of their neck. I might actually have one. I should check. Anyway. Anyway. All right. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I'll be on Discord again, Ron. I'm probably going to hop on there tonight, actually, after this, because I have another big project I got to work on. So, I'll be in either in the Nook or in Soundbooth Theater's Discord. Okay. Yeah, Gary's hilarious. That's so much fun, too, because, like, we pick all the words before, like, when we're rehearsing for the actual show, about an hour before the show starts. We pick all the words. So he just said, give us adjectives that describe 90s cartoons, and then just give us names of cheese. So we all, like, collectively decided on those. I am so happy that I got the gross maggot cheese, too. That is not a sentence I ever thought I would say. Okay, here we go.
Chapter 5. By the Blood of the Wolf. Imelda Nieves squatted over the blood spatters marring the pebbled beach. The bare footprint of a flame demon stood out as clear as day beside the tiny child-sized boot prints of the wolf. They'd searched entire entire houses. Oh no, that's not what I said. That's not what that says. They'd searched entire hours away for the two beasts, but both had eluded them as if they'd simply disappeared. The Jinni she could understand. He could simply twist to the Firelands and be gone, but the wolf? Imelda picked up a blood-covered stone and twisted it in the glare of her flashlight. A blood rite. She would have bet her job on it. What kind of moon-cursed demonkin dealt in Jinni and blood rites? And how could a wolf simply vanish? They'd had every instrument available trained on the beast, 6 entire acquisition teams converging at once, and the monster had simply vanished, leaving only a spattering of blood behind to taunt them. Had it used a wish, then? A wish to escape? Imelda had been one of the closest at hand when the sniper had botched his first shot, and she personally didn't think that the wolf had been given enough time to make a wish. The beast had simply changed and run. That also bothered her. Why would a wolf run? Every possessed soul she'd ever encountered went on the attack the moment the Third Lander took control. It was their natures. The malicious, ravenous beasts of the Third Realm simply did not have the mental restraint to work out such things as plans and strategy. They were vicious predators, crafted into cruel and brutal killers by the cold and violence of the Frostlands. They didn't understand retreat. Something wasn't adding up. Imelda's co-leader of this mission, Segunda Inquisidora Zeneida, thought that the Jinni was bound to the possessed woman's pendant. But Imelda couldn't understand how a wolf could have disappeared, even with the Jinni's help. Wolves were bottom tier, barely more than savages. Certainly that would have taken a wish for the Fourth Lander magics to have enough sway to change the tides of history in such a way. The wolf had been theirs. Imelda had reviewed the video footage repeatedly. The Jinni had lit up like a flare on the screen as opposed to the warm reds and oranges of the wolf and her pursuers. The wolf had disappeared first, and the Jinni had begun moving at horrendous speeds through the forest before he had simply vanished with her. The vibrating buzz of her phone interrupted her thoughts. Switching hands on her flashlight, Imelda pulled the slim instrument from her front chest pocket. Flipping it open, she put it to her ear. Diga. On the other end, Inquisitor Zeneida's deceptively soft voice said, Have you found the Jinni and its pendant yet, Imelda? As always, the Segunda Inquisidora used Imelda's common name instead of her rightful Segunda Inquisidora Nieve. The same rank on paper as Zeneida, though Zeneida maintained several decades of seniority. Zeneida, Imelda knew, didn't like the fact that there was only time in service between her own job and Imelda's, and the woman took every opportunity to try and increase the distance. Imelda narrowed her eyes and replied, There is no sign of the wolf, Inquisidora. Then you are not looking hard enough. Search to the south. That's the direction the Jinni was headed before it disappeared. They were likely headed towards Anchorage. Imelda fought a surge of anger at Zeneida's command. As if she is the holy matron herself, she thought, irritated. Restraining herself from saying something she would regret, she replied with a curt, There is nothing to suggest they went south. There's a city to the south. What better way to lose our hunters than to mingle their scent with those of thousands? Go to Anchorage. You'll find them there. There is no trail, Inquisidora, Imelda said, fighting frustration. The blood simply vanishes. Then scry the blood, you fool! Imelda's fingers tightened on the phone. The last thing she wanted to do was enact a scrying spell. If the beast was what she suspected, that spell would work both ways. She said as much. Magus? Inquisidora Zenaida snorted as if she'd suggested the Pope was possessed of a Thirdlander. It's not. I would have sensed as much. She could hear the woman sneer as she added, Besides, all of my kind died over 1,000 years ago. Regardless, I have evidence of a blood right, Inquisidora, Imelda growled. They had exchanged some sort of pact before we got into position. Then you have the beast's blood, Zenaida said, undaunted. Use it and bind it. That genie could change everything. Imelda made a face and threw the bloody rock she held back to the ground, though she was careful to keep from transmitting her frustration. She took several moments to collect herself before biting out. If you are wrong, Inquisidora, and we are dealing with a magus and not a wolf, then we might be doing more damage than good. Inquisidora Zenaida had the audacity to laugh over the link. Just because you do not understand the magics and see their weaves, Imelda, does not mean that others share your weakness. I looked upon the wolf, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yes, but Imelda started. Zenaida, as was her habit, didn't allow her to finish. In a patronizing sneer, she said, I shook her hand, Imelda. It's just a wolf, confirmed by the scent of moon magics and the shift we caught on camera. Scry her out, kill her, and bring back the talisman. You shall be given no other mission until this one is complete. With that, the line went dead. Arrogant coño! Imelda snarled, lunging from her squat beside the bloodied sands. She angrily snapped the phone shut and shoved it back to the pocket in her chest. She saw a few decades of demon hunting, and she believes she is God's gift to the Order. Angrily, Imelda paced downriver, following the genie's light stride. At easily 7 feet tall, the flamekin only weighed a fraction of the tiny Thirdlander wolf, and by the light impressions in the soil, she guessed that his gross total was probably somewhere around 100 pounds, perhaps less. The weights added up. A much too heavy Thirdlander wolf and a much too light Fourthlander flamekin. But still, her gut was telling her something was off, that it wasn't as simple as it appeared. Still. Still irritated at her superior's conceit, Imelda followed the oddly juxtaposed tracks, considering her predicament. As of that conversation, she had been effectively assigned to the genie. The genie, however, had disappeared, and if Imelda wanted to take part in the historic, momentous cleansing of the rest of this contaminated land, she had to find him. She shook her head. Inquisidora Zenaida had been a Segunda Inquisidora for at least a couple decades, yet still hadn't moved up to the next rung in the order, a Grande Inquisidora. Imelda, only 33, had gained all but the last 2 ranks within her short lifetime, without the aid of magic or ancient bloodlines. For this, she was sure Zenaida despised her. Imelda stopped, once again peering down at the spatters of blood upon the stones at her feet. She knew how to scry, and carried the proper instrument to form a link, but aside from the obvious potential for problems if she linked to the wrong victim, it was distasteful to her. She reviled the thought of drinking blood tainted with wolf, not only because she had the nagging fear that their possession was contagious, but because the last thing she wanted to do was enter the mind of a monster, however temporary. She had been forced to do so in the past while hunting vampire clans in Poland, and the mental sickness that had carried over the link had left Imelda reeling for weeks. Which was, of course, probably exactly why Zenaida wanted her to cement such a bond. They were on the verge of clearing out the last major pocket of corruption on the face of the planet, a festering pustule of rot, the massive extent of which they were only now beginning to fully understand. And she was doing everything in her power to put Imelda out of the center of operations, to handicap her as they made history. And while Imelda and Zenaida did technically wear the same rank, the rash, arrogant magus carried the seniority, and a genie was certainly considered a great enough prize to devote the full attentions of a Segunda Inquisidora to his capture. Thus, Zenaida did have the power to keep Imelda from the forefront of the battle if she could not complete this mission, and both Imelda and Zenaida knew it would be all but impossible to pin down a fourth lander who could slip realms as easily as breathing. The Jinni was a wild goose chase, Zenaida's attempt to keep Imelda out of the action, and it infuriated her. But then again, Imelda thought as she looked down at the blood spatters, perhaps Zenaida's plan was not as foolproof as it seemed. After all, if Imelda were to bring in a Jinni, she could hardly be ignored when the time came for the order to name a new Grande Inquisidor. As far as she knew, the Jinn were all dead, and not one had ever been taken into custody. Reluctantly, she squatted and trained her flashlight on the old blood once more. The wolf had wounded itself. What else could that be other than a blood rite? Gingerly, she selected a small stone that was relatively clean except for its brown crust. Cradling it in her palm, she peered down at it, debating. Imelda had a nagging suspicion that Zenaida was wrong about the wolf. What kind of moon curse dealt in blood pacts? That was a Magus' stock and trade. And the Magi were dead. Over 1,000 years dead. Or so Zenaida claimed. God, but her head hurt. While migraines had bothered Imelda for as long as she could remember, in the last few weeks in preparation for taking the Phoenix, the pressure had increased almost exponentially. It was now a glassy fuzz at the edges of her vision, one that did not appreciate the too bright light of her flashlight. Powered by the glow of a Fey star dancer, it had no LED or bulb to break, had no batteries to charge, could last... Had no batteries to charge, could cast a light for miles if desired, and weighed no more than a pencil. Imelda closed her eyes, took a deep breath, then let it out between her teeth. Daughter of the ghetto, raised to become a sister of the order, now a slayer of demons. Zenaida's station as Segunda Inquisidora, one of the very evil-doers they were attempting to eradicate, had not been the least of her surprises upon taking that coveted black uniform. Before taking her vows, she had never even suspected that the Church would deal in the very powers and poisons and possessions. Oh my. She had never even suspected that the Church would deal in the very powers and poisons and possessions it fought to destroy. That literally every mechanism of the Order was powered by the beasts they captured had left her in tears for weeks. It had been a shock, but as her padre had assured her with an unhappy shake of his head, she had finally come to understand that to fight fire, one must sometimes use matches. Still, she found it distasteful that Zenaida flagrantly flaunted her magics in public and condemned those who did not have them, made her gut twist all the more. A Magus, working within the Order as if she had every right to be there. At least, she thought her padre had the right of things when he had confessed to her that Zenaida, with all of her seniority and decades of experience, would never make Grande Inquisidora on that single fact alone. Zenaida was, after all, one of the very things that the Order hunted. Often, Imelda wondered which and how Zenaida had gained her powers so long after the Magi were supposedly extinct. Zenaida's record was sealed in the archives, and while Father Vega confessed to her that he had known about Zenaida during his time in the Order 50 years ago, no one seemed to be able to remember when she had joined. At least the Order recognized a limit. If Zenaida hadn't taken the title in 5 decades, she would never make Grande Inquisidora. On the other hand, Imelda, as mud-born and as human as the Pope himself, only had a few short years before she took that coveted title and moved to Rome, leaving Zenaida with her precious decades of seniority over some other misfortunate Segunda. From there, if she worked hard and stayed devout to the cause, she would eventually take Holy Matron of the Order. Her padre, a man quietly gifted with the sight, had seen it. He had seen it, and he had entrusted her with knowledge of his gift, knowing that should the others of her order ever discover it, he would join the beasts on the rack. Follow your heart, little one. and nor even the seat of the Holy Matron will hold dominion over you. Stop putting me in the chick track. That is the wrong place for my lines. Okay, cool. Every one of his predictions had come true thus far, even the seemingly ridiculous one of gaining Segunda Inquisidora at the age of 26. She still marveled at that, and made the trek for his counsel every chance she got. She had also sworn on her mother's blood to keep his secret, for while it was 1,000 times more common than, say, a phoenix, the life liquids of a seer had dozens of different applications for the betterment of the order: looking glasses, headpieces, meditation bowls, or the tiny crystal scrying goblet she carried sheathed in a padded slip of silk in her backpack. Closing her fist around the bloodied stone, Imelda considered. Sometimes, her padre's words returned to her, one must fight fire with matches. And in this case, the matches came in the form of a wolf's blood, their only real lead in all of this. Reluctantly, she bent to her pack and slipped the faceted Faystone goblet from its pouch, its vibrant violet surfaces catching the glare of her flashlight in unspeakable, heart-searing brilliance. All right, wolf. Time to show me your genie. She dropped the bloodied pebble into the goblet's bowl and went to the river for water to complete the scrying spell. As she bent to fill the bowl, she casually glanced up the river in the direction the wolf and genie had been traveling before their sniper had missed his target. Missed. An expert marksman. Almost as if the damned wolf had a spell of diversion wrapped around. Imelda froze. She glanced down at the bloodied stone, even then sitting in the dry bowl of the goblet, then at the gray, silty water that slid by only inches beneath the violet Faystone artifact. Slowly, she lifted her hand away from the river. Too many things were not adding up. First the genie, then the blood pact, then the disappearance. And to top it all off, one of her hunters, a born sniper, a man who could pit a cherry at a mile, had missed. From across the river, 600 feet tops, no breeze. Very carefully, she plucked the bloodied stone back out of the crystal goblet and considered it. Her instincts were unusually good. So good, in fact, that she had become the youngest sister to make Segunda Inquisidora in the history of the Order. After another moment's debate, she slipped the Faystone goblet back into its silken case and returned it to her backpack. Zenaida had given her an order, true, but Imelda wasn't going to make it to the seat of the Holy Matron by being a fool. Besides, on paper, she and the Magus were of the same rank. If Zenaida wanted to try and argue seniority, let her do so before a tribunal in Rome, where 100 of Zenaida's kind had died in the very basement beneath their enclave. As an afterthought, Imelda dropped the blood-caked stone into a collection tube, and, twisting on the plastic cap, tucked it into a vest pocket. Then, turning, she picked up her radio and called in the helicopter to come get her. The two fugitives had been going north along the river. Zenaida be damned. Imelda's gut told her they were headed towards the mountains, not back to Anchorage. And since this had officially become Imelda's operation as of 10 minutes ago, she would run the mission how she saw fit, and if it came to that, deal with a tribunal later. She knew who would meet her end in the basement should Zenaida... She knew who would meet her end in the basement should Zenaida challenge her. Oh, man. Oh. Wait, is this... That's just a scene break. That's not a chapter break. Okay. I thought that was a chapter break. Okay, let me do that as a scene break then. Akrab lifted the wolf, easily 3 or 4 times his weight despite her tiny size, into his arms, and ducked into the frigid forest to find cover. While all other realmers felt cool to Akrab's Fourthlander heat, his Magus's body was cold, much colder than a normal Firstlander body should have been. Void-walking, in your condition, was not the wisest thing you've ever done, Mondib, he muttered, setting her down beside a fallen log and looking for enough wood to light a fire. They follow you by air, the winds breathed as he gathered tinder. Akrab froze. Their pursuers had followed them riding their iron beasts of the sky. Let me double-check the winds. I had those show up a bit later. Okay. Good, I was keeping that consistent. Yeah, hey. Biting his lip, he looked up at the breeze as it played amongst the darkened treetops, then back down at his sleeping Magus. If he lit a fire, would they see the smoke at night? And more importantly, would they see the flame? Little wolf, he growled, crouching beside her crumpled, pallid form. Wake up and warm yourself, or I will be forced to do it for you. He knew she had a dozen different spells she used to keep her body warm, and also knew that whatever had happened, they were no longer working. He also knew what her reaction would be if she woke to find herself snuggled naked against his hot Fourthlander body, her frozen clothes hung to steam from a branch above him. The Magus did not respond. You told me not to touch you, Akrab cursed, glaring at her. Wake up! He was not a Magus. At least not by Firstlander standards. He channeled the creative power of the Fourthlands, flirted with law whenever he got the chance, but he could not cast lasting, time-based spells without use of a wish. He could not, therefore, cast the shields, barriers, and wards that his Magus wove so effortlessly around herself as easily as breathing. He also knew the Magus was perfectly capable of sealing her own wounds, as evidenced by the smooth skin beneath the mangled, bloody holes in her garb, but he could not tell without touching her whether or not she had removed the bullets from her body, or what their makeup had been, or whether she was still being poisoned by some unknown substance. Mondib, he growled at her pale, limp form. You're not leaving me much choice. The last thing he wanted was to be caught groping the Fury in her sleep. That could get unpleasant. Off in the distance he heard gunshots. Akrab glanced to the west, where the sound had come from. A group of stone-working Fae had taken up residence in the hill where the Ursine couple had died. A crusty old Fae lord who'd gotten himself expelled from the Second Lands and the 6 descendants that had chosen to go with him. Akrab knew they would die to the last before being taken by Inquisitors. Mondib, he muttered, eyes blindly seeking out the shadows of the creek through the trees. This is a very inopportune time to take a nap. If she heard him, his slender waif of a Magus showed no sign. In fact, her breathing had dropped to barely a whisper in her chest. He peered at her, trying to determine the extent of the damage, but his eyes could not adjust to the unnatural blackness of a Firstlander night. Aside from the greater darkness of her bloodied clothes, he had no idea what was wrong with her. It could be Inquisitor poisons, could be a loss of blood, could be the cold. Mondib. Kashifa! He put his hand to her shoulder and shook it. Still, no response. Her head lolled softly to one side, exposing her slender neck to him. Had she sealed all of her wounds? Had she forgotten the bullets? Were they even then seeping their poisons into her veins? He hated the darkness of the first lands. He could not see. Reluctantly watching the west, he produced a small flame in his palm and held it over her. What he saw made his heart shudder to a stop. Her skin was too pale, her lips too blue. Her fingernails, too, shared that odd, too dark hue. Her blood was soaked into the fabric covering one hip, and it slicked down an entire leg, freezing into hard, rumpled folds of crimson cloth. And now that he looked carefully, there was ice forming in her hair, on her lashes, in her clothes, at the corners of her fingertips. The breezes were flitting in the branches above, almost as if invisible spirits were clinging to the trees, watching. Biting his lip, he closed his hand over the flame, putting it out. Looking up at the rustling treetops, he ventured, "These ones who are looking for us, they are coming? Soon. Soon," the winds seemed to whisper. Even then, he could hear the telltale whine of a boat engine out on the river. While innocuous before, since it was a sound often heard in the fishing community of Squentna, the sound now filled him with dread. For no one traveled the river at nightfall, at the onset of winter, with hazardously low water and chunks of ice to capsize the unwary. Akrab glanced down at his Magus, her body much too cold, and then the forest around him. He considered taking her back to the Firelands. But instinctively knew she wouldn't survive another trip so soon after her last. He thought about yanking her to the half-realm, but knew that with as much blood as she'd lost, the shock might be too much for her. The whine of the boat engine was growing louder, echoing against the trees. Hastily, he began piling frozen moss, dead leaves, branches, grass, and debris over his Magus. Once he was satisfied she had been concealed, he twisted to the half-realm and waited. The crystalline white dunes spread out in all directions, overlaid by the glittering black trunks of spruce trees and birch. All around him the winds whistled through the sparkling structures, impossibly swaying their crystalline forms back and forth as they fretted and danced above, so thick they could almost be seen as glittering wisps of color. Focusing yet again on his Magus. What did she do to receive their attention? He thought bitterly. He'd spent countless years in captivity, and had never so much as heard a whisper. Yet she had received warning twice in as many days. Reluctantly, he tore his eyes from the swirling winds and waited for their pursuer to show itself. For long moments, nothing happened. Then, in almost utter silence, black shadows slipped in the gray sky overhead. Akrab frowned. Was it dipping to meet him? "Run!" the wind screamed suddenly, shoving him away from his Magus, pushing him into a jog. "Twist to the fourth lands, fool!" Fool? Since when did the winds have the audacity to call a Jinni a fool? Akrab stumbled to a halt and looked up at the iron beast. He could barely hear the thrumming its blades made as they cut the air. Then the sound of gunfire echoed around him, spitting up crystalline shards of obsidian at his feet. Seeing that, Akrab frowned. It was almost as if the sky-born beast was watching him. But that was impossible. Safely ensconced in the half-realm, he was but a mirage upon the cold face of the first realm. He backed a few feet out of their range of fire, only to watch the iron beast twist in the sky to face him. Twist? In the sky? Since when could anything but a dragon see a Jinni in the half-realm? Unless... Akrab felt his throat go tight. If they were using a dragon's eyes in the iron beast, they would see him even better at night. And he'd led them right to the wolf. He turned from his Magus then, horror lacing his veins, and ran, trying to get them to give chase. The iron monster turned in the sky and followed, its silent glass windows a deeper black against the darkness as it peppered the ground with metal. Just before he hit the end of his tether, he twisted to the fire realm and prayed. And now we... Oh, it's another seed break. God damn it.
Check the next page, Zach. Check the next page, Zach. Okay, we started at... Okay, cool. So we're about 30 minutes into that chapter.
Imelda ordered the helicopter down on the frozen creek bank beside the jagged hole in the ice. "You must have tried to cross," her scout Jacot yelled as he ducked his head and met the helicopter. He still wore his wetsuit, his face steaming in the red glow of the helicopter interior. Chuckling, the Frenchman said, "Le démon gigantesque must have found he was not as light on his feet as he thought." He shook his head amusedly. "Le connard." Her skull already pounding from the painful thrumming of the rotor blades, Imelda grunted and ducked out of the helicopter to walk to the creek's edge. Her gut was still telling her there was more to the story. Light though he was, what kind of demon of the flame would chance walking across thin ice in the First Realm when he could simply twist to the Halflands or the Firelands to travel the same terrain out of danger? When she grew close enough to see the cracked ice with her flashlight, she stopped and frowned. A trail of water droplets led out from the break, though she could see no footprints in either direction. To Jacot, who had followed her to the water's edge, she said, "And the wolf was never seen?" "La Louve has not yet shown herself, Inquisitrice." Imelda frowned and shone the flashlight into the forest on the other side of the creek, back towards the sleeping lady and beyond Anchorage. That she had been correct in seeking the Jinni to the north was a small victory, but one that she was sure would haunt her later, when Inquisidora Zeneida learned of her disobedience. Imelda took a moment to study the swamp grasses lining the creek, then lifted her light to examine the forest beyond. While she could not be absolutely positive at this distance, she could not see a trail of melted footprints and frostless leaves leading from the woods. The Jinni ran an average temperature of 80 degrees Celsius, about 175 degrees Fahrenheit in this incomprehensible land of fools, and one of the things she'd noticed upon searching the wreckage of the gun battle had been that wherever the Jinni went, he left melted frost in his wake. She twisted, shining her light into the forest where the Jinni had disappeared. She started following the now frozen water spatters into the woods. "You believe La Louve was here, Mamie?" Oh wait, that's Jacot talking. Yay, do that one. "You believe La Louve was here, Mamie?" Imelda hesitated at a clump. Imelda hesitated at a clump of burned grass. Nope, I swallowed that. Imelda hesitated at a clump of burned grass. Beside it, blood had congealed and frozen on the iced, silty ground. She crouched beside it, getting a better look. "Tell me, Jacko," she said, picking up a crimson-stained leaf. "What color is the blood of a genie?" Jacko frowned at the leaf. "Jinn do not bleed, Inquisitrice." Once they'd discovered they were dealing with a Fourthlander, he had spent hours with Imelda in the library, poring through every article the Order had on flame demons, finally helping her to narrow it down to a genie. Imelda lowered the leaf back to the ground and considered the blood. It, combined with the blood she had seen spattered across the span of over a mile, left little for the wolf, if any. She shone her light around the area, found the spot where the genie had knelt, his knee impressions 2 melted divots in the jagged crystals of the hard frozen mud of the creek bank. So, the genie had attempted to save the wolf. Imelda shone the light once more on the cracked surface of the slow-moving creek. The wolf, being heavier than the genie, had fallen through the ice. Had he been carrying her across the creek? It made no sense, because aside from the area directly around the blood, there were no massive footprints melted into the ice. So how had a wolf walked across ice that thin, only to fall in halfway? Then once immersed, how did she get out again without breaking the rest of the ice? Leveling her light once more on the genie's footprints, she got up and followed them into the forest. They stopped beside a man-sized mound of torn-up mosses, branches, and dead leaves. "Weapons!" Imelda cried, drawing her pistol. She fired 3 shots into the pile, then hesitated when it didn't move. Beside her, Jacques had his rifle up, the barrel leveled on the mound of debris. "Guard!" Imelda told him, slipping to a crouch and picking up a nearby stick. Using it at a distance, she pried mosses and debris from where the genie had piled it around the wolf's body. And it was a body. She straightened slowly, eyeing the pale visage of death beneath the forest detritus. So that was why the wolf hadn't shown up on radar. It was dead. The wounds she had given it were ragged holes in the meat, not even bleeding. Imelda nudged it with a foot, then tucked her gun back into its holster. Squatting beside it, she shone the light into the corpse's face. As she had noted back at the sleeping lady, the dead woman appeared to come from one of the purer lines of Arabic descent. Carefully, Imelda leaned forward and put her fingers to the wolf's neck, just to be sure. She counted a full minute with no pulse. She waited 3, just to be sure. As she moved away, her light flickered off a bit of silver clinging to the woman's neck, mostly hidden by her frozen sweater. Frowning, Imelda considered it, but made no motion to reach for it. "Shall we take the body back with us?" Jacques asked. He had not lifted the muzzle of his rifle from the corpse's face. "Our order has no use for a dead wolf." She gestured at the chopper. "Go radio Inquisidora Zenera. Tell her the wolf is dead." Jacques made a courteous bow. Jacques made a courteous bow and jogged off through the woods toward the creek. Imelda waited until her scout was out of sight to retrieve the pendant from around the wolf's neck. Though crude and worn, the silvery symbol almost reminded her of an elaborate winged sword. The emblem nagged at her somehow, tickling the furthest corners of her mind. She had seen something similar before, she was sure. But where? It wasn't a Jinni symbol. The Jinni loathed metal weapons of any sort, and instead did battle with their words. She rolled the symbol in her hands, considering. It felt odd, ancient even. She spent minutes staring at it, wishing desperately that she could wrench that knowledge from whatever cubby she had tucked it, however many years ago. Behind her, she heard Jacques returning at a jog, and on instinct tucked the symbol into a pocket to be analyzed later. "La Inquisitrice wants to know of the wolf symbol, Mamie," Jacques said, slowing beside her. He handed a radio out to her. "What did you tell her?" Imelda asked, taking it. "I said I was unsure. I left before we searched the body." Imelda nodded and depressed the send button. Eyes on Jacques, she said, "It looks as if the Ginny took this symbol, Segunda Inquisidora. There was nothing on her body." Above her, she thought she saw Jacques stiffen ever so slightly. So he had seen. Damn. Fortunately, Imelda knew that man had the good sense to keep his mouth shut. He was a bright soul. He knew Imelda bore no responsibility to report to the Segunda Inquisidora out of anything more than courtesy, and he knew better than to stick his foot into order politics. Inquisidora Zenaida cursed on the other end of the radio. We needed that talisman, Imelda. He could have escaped to the Fire Lands by now. Did you get a good look at it, at least? There is nothing here to suggest that anything was actually keeping him here in the first place, Inquisidora. Perhaps this Ginny was simply friends with the wolf. Zenaida cackled into the radio. Have you ever met a Ginny, you camel-toed bitch? Not only do they hate the First Lands, but the only ones who can stand their word-weavings are their own kind. It's like oil and water. A Ginny would throw a wolf into a rage simply by opening his mouth. Imelda found herself prickling all over again. This is an open band, Inquisidora. Mind your tongue or I will cut it off. Every member of the Order within range would have heard the woman's disrespect.
What the hell? Oh.
Whoopsie. Every member of the Order within range would have heard the woman's disrespect, and Imelda's reply. For a long moment there was utter silence on the other end of the radio. Then softly, Zenaida said, You will remain tasked to the Ginny until you bring him home. The transmission ended with static. Imelda grunted and returned the radio to Jacques, who was giving her an odd look. Is there a reason why we lied to La Inquisitrice? She's a power-hungry concha, Imelda said, grateful to her Paraguayan friends for the perfect word to describe the cunt she worked with. That, and I bet my pistol isn't what is binding the Ginny. Jacques raised both eyebrows, but nodded. As you say, madame. She sighed. Still, we must test it. Dragging the symbol from her pocket, she held it up between them. Would you like to do the honors, Jacques? Or shall I? The Frenchman eyed the talisman as if it were the head of a viper. Crossing himself, he said, The honor is all yours, mamie. Imelda grinned at the Frenchman's reaction. While she herself found magic despicable, Jacques would rather die by fire than touch an article crafted with it. Of all the 21 members of her team, Jacques was one of the 3 who refused all augmented gear. He would get into a helicopter if given no other alternative, but he always made certain no part of it contacted his skin. Very well, Imelda said. Gripping the symbol in a fist, she said, Ginny of this talisman, I claim your service, and I call upon you to grant my wish. She thought perhaps the breezes increased in the branches above, but it could have been her imagination. Imelda tried again in Arabic this time. She tried 3 more languages, then sighed and dropped the talisman back into a pocket. It did not work. She could not tell if Jacques was grateful or disappointed with the result. Imelda shrugged. Perhaps there is something else the wolf carries with her that we have not yet seen. Because Jacques would not touch the body, he belonged to one of the stricter sects of the Order who would not even profane their skin with the flesh of the cursed. Imelda told him to go looking for traces of the Ginny, as she began to roll the already stiffening corpse onto its back alone. Imelda spent a good several minutes searching the wolf's body, looking for some sign of how she had simply vanished. She found nothing. The woman's pockets were completely empty, and she had carried no backpack that they had been able to find. That bothered Imelda. How had the wolf planned to survive the trek through the forest? She had been back to the sleeping lady. Of that Imelda was sure. The generator had been shut off, and the clothes the wolf now wore were identical to the ones that were now missing from a precautionary photograph she'd taken of the cabin after she'd ransacked it. So where had the wolf been planning to go without food, gear, and matches? She had to have some sort of safe haven in mind. Somewhere to the north, a cabin or a lodge, somewhere between here and Denali National Park? Or beyond it? Encompassing over 9,000 square miles of federally owned wilderness, no private dwellings were allowed within the boundaries of the vast park itself. It was possible that demons had created a safe haven somewhere within, but not probable. As one of Alaska's greatest tourist destinations, the entire park was carefully patrolled by overzealous rangers who were known to stop their helicopters to pick up a single piece of trash that had blown off of the park's only two-lane roadside. The Ginny's goal had to be before the park, didn't it? They couldn't possibly have been planning to go over the Alaska Range. After all, there were literally dozens of fishing lodges, hunting retreats, and recreational cabins between Carboy Creek and the Alaska Range. But which one had they been aiming for? The tiny woman's blood-drenched clothes left no indication of their destination. Eventually, Imelda stood up, disgusted, and retrieved her pistol from its belt. She slapped a new magazine of silver into its base and sighted down the barrel at the wolf's head. Her research had suggested that a Ginny had a meager supply of Fourthlander magic to use at whim, which meant a Ginny had some ability to heal, even without use of a wish, and Imelda wasn't about to take chances that the duo were somehow more friendly than Zenaida suspected. After all, not even a Ginny could patch together someone's skull if it were properly blown apart. She was tightening her finger upon the trigger when a sudden, icy breeze nudged her from behind, shoving her forward a step, tracing frigid fingers down her neck. The winds had picked up around her, and what Imelda had at first taken for rotor wash, she quickly discovered was something else entirely. Wind wrenched at the treetops overhead, slapping branches together in its force. Then, from behind, light seared the darkness suddenly. Too bright to have come from any human source. Imelda twisted, gun in hand. An angel was standing behind her, formed of wisps of frost and vapor. "Our sister of vengeance," the radiant entity whispered to her, words so deep and so powerful Imelda heard them in her soul.
What the hell? No, why didn't it record?
Our sister. Our sister of vengeance, the radiant entity whispered to her, words so deep and so powerful Imelda heard them in her soul. Immediately, Imelda fell to her knees, making the sign of the cross upon her chest. "Mother of God," she whispered, in awe of the angel before her. It looked to be not one, but 1,000 of them, their faces fluctuating, moving, changing. But there was no mistaking the heavenly radiance searing from their wings and their sword.
God damn it, why is it suddenly stopping recording?
"Mother of God," she whispered, in awe of the angel before her. It looked to be not one, but 1,000 of them, their faces fluctuating, moving, changing. But there was no mistaking the heavenly radiance searing from their wings and their sword. She crossed herself again and bowed her head and whispered the prayer to Saint Michael. She was still finishing it when Jacot came jogging up, panting. "What was that light, Inquisitrice?" Imelda ignored him, finishing the final plea to the Archangel, her fingers clutching the cross at her chest. O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Okay, good.
When she looked up, the vision was gone. You summoned the demon? Jacques sounded wary, and he was keeping a distance, his rifle up, staring nervously at the frosty shrubbery in front of her. Slowly getting back up from her knees, still in shock, Imelda shook her head, still awash in wonder. Our sister of vengeance. The angel had spoken to her, given her a message. Madame Inquisitrice. Still silent, Imelda looked down at the corpse. Around them, the wind was whipping in the trees, tearing branches from above to come cascading down around them. Imelda barely heard it. Her heart was still pounding with the joy of meeting one of her Lord's messengers. I was just given a sign, Jacques. Jacques eyed the treetops cautiously. A sign, Madame Inquisitrice. An angel, she whispered, her eyes still fixed to the place where the vision had disappeared. He came to me. Now Jacques was eyeing her with caution. Tentatively, the Frenchman said, Messengers often appeal to God's chosen, Inquisitrice. Doubtless she could see him thinking, a possible cause behind her spectacular rise through the ranks of the Order. The thought that she was one of God's chosen left Imelda with a sudden wash of joy that she quickly squashed. Pride was the first step before the fall. Taking a deep breath, she released the cross at her neck and replaced the gun to her hip. This is to stay between the two of us, Jacques. Jacques nodded, and with a wary glance at the forest around them said, Then if you do not mind, Mamie, I would retreat from under these trees. With the crash of a falling birch only 100 feet distant, Imelda readily agreed. She jogged to follow Jacques as he ducked through the creaking, howling stand of birch, and was already well out of the forest on her way back to the helicopter when she realized something was heating through the bulletproof lining of her chest plate. Frowning, she dug her fingers into her pocket and pulled out the wolf's talisman. It was hot to the touch. She hesitated, turning back, glancing at the wind-whipped forest. Another birch tree fell with a massive crash, snapping limbs from a spruce and shearing a stand of willow in half. She hadn't shot the wolf. Her bodyguard slammed a heavy hand on her shoulder, startling her. Gesturing to the cockpit and the German pilot who was even then struggling to keep the helicopter stable, Giuseppe, a former Italian mobster turned warrior of God, cried, "We need to get out of here, Inquisidor. If we don't lift off now, the winds will tear us apart." Even then, another massive birch, unstable and without taproots in the 6 inches of loam that was the extent of Alaskan topsoil, came crashing down like a titan, this time landing in the creek only 50 feet from the helicopter's rotors. Another quickly followed on the other side of the creek. Pocketing the talisman once more, Imelda hurried after Giuseppe to board the chopper. "Sit down and hold on, Inquisitorine," her older German pilot rumbled at her. "Bulma!" He bent to his control. Now that needs to be deeper. "This figure is trying to pull us into the Bulma."
Yeah, I don't like the way I did Drescher just then. He had a deeper voice when I workshopped him.
"Sit down and hold on, Inquisitorine," her older German pilot rumbled at her. "This figure is trying to pull us into the Bulma." He bent to his controls and started yelling in German, though if it was to her or his co-pilot, who was hastily strapping in beside him, or to God in general, she had no idea. All she knew was that the helicopter was lurching dangerously towards the edge of the forest, and the pilot's German was getting more frantic. The next few heart-stopping moments had the rotors within feet of the twisted branches jutting out from the birch and cottonwoods before they spun up enough to lift them out of the wind-whipped gully, scraping one of their skids on the canopy as they pulled free. "To Hugenson!" the graying pilot howled, laughing and shaking a fist at the trees pulling out of reach beneath them. "Ha ha ha! Deine Mutter schwitzt beim Kacken! Fick dich! Fick dich! Lutscheine Eier, Mutterficker!" Still laughing, he slapped the helicopter's dash like he was congratulating an old friend, then started babbling to the co-pilot in loud, happy German. "In English!" she cried. Her flat-faced Italian bodyguard glanced over his shoulder to her and said, "Herr Drescher says that we are free of the trees, Inquisidora." Imelda raised an eyebrow, for she was pretty sure she'd heard something about a whore in there, but wasn't about to argue. Though she was not skilled in the art of piloting aircraft, she'd seen plenty of crashes to know that had one of those rotors. Though she was not skilled in the art of piloting aircraft, she'd seen plenty of crashes to know that had one of those rotors contacted one of those trees, her night would have gone from bad to worse. "Begin a search pattern. Start here, move in concentric circles outward. The genie can't have gone far." Giuseppe calmly relayed her order to the pilot, who was still yelling and shaking his fist at the ground. Upon hearing her command, the big man turned suddenly in his seat, his blond, hairy face filled with disgust. "I'm taking this schlemper home and Inquisitorin. Look at the trees. It's a Chinook." A Chinook was, Imelda had learned after 6 months of living in this unpredictable part of the United States, the native Alaskan word for warm wind. It was volatile and sudden, and was responsible for ripping apart entire airfields in its passage, tumbling bush planes and helicopters into piles like discarded toys. It had been responsible for 70-degree temperature shifts overnight, and had been known to tear the roofs off of the local schools. It could also last for entire weeks. Cursing, Imelda said, "Fly around it." "Fly around the wind, Inquisitorin?" Herr Drescher laughed. He gestured a hairy arm at the ground, where even then, more trees were twisting and snapping in the breeze. "Of course." No, wait, that's French. "Of course. Just tell me where the wind is not." "The wind is not, of course. Just tell me where the wind is not." "Well, of course." "Of course. Just tell me where the wind is not while I keep us from rolling us into the treetops." "This was not on this morning's weather briefing," Imelda snapped, watching birch trees bend dangerously in the forest beneath her. "Then let us put our complaints to God, and allow me to take us back home before I lose control of this whore again." He had already turned the helicopter around and was heading back toward the enclave hidden up in the valley below He had already turned the helicopter around and was heading back toward the enclave hidden up in the valley below Ekluntna. He had already turned the helicopter around and was heading back toward the enclave hidden up in the valley below Ekluntna Lake. Imelda glared at him. The Germans were infuriating to work with. They were loud, boisterous, irreverent, liked to drink, and did not take orders well. She also knew, however, that Herr Drescher was one of the best men at his job, and she probably already owed her life to him that day. "Very well," she muttered, as if he were waiting for her response. "Take us home, then. We shall await the fading of the winds while you pray for forgiveness for your transgressions of speech." "My what?" the blonde German yelled back at her over his meaty shoulder. "Your foul mouth!" she yelled back. "Oh, ho, ho! That." He shook his head. To his co-pilot, he chuckled a long string of German, and then said to her, "As your command, Frau Niefe." Gaining loft, Drescher tilted the nose forward, and they were plowing through the air with great speed, though still sliding sideways due to the sudden force of the winds. As they flew, Imelda once more reached into her pocket and pulled the wolf's talisman free. It was still warm in her hands, though that could easily be attributed to her own body temperature. Had she imagined its heat? Had she really seen the Lord's messenger? Somehow she knew the two of them were linked. Yet she had not the first idea of what our sister of vengeance meant. Was it the name of a saint? She would have to consult her padre.
man. All right. Let's see how everyone's doing. Kluntna, okay. Let me go back and fix that. Alright, I think that should be okay. Let me check and see if we can do that. Okay, so it's 65 to 81, so I think that's 16 pages. How long was this one? Oh yeah, that was way longer. Okay, cool. Let me air this out and I'll have time to do one more. Sorry, just SPT's messaging me. I'm going to talk to them real quick. How are we doing? No need for AC in Alaska. I am a Cali dude, yes. Yeah, born and raised. I actually quite like it. I've been okay with it. Just don't go to Los Angeles if you can avoid it, basically. Or at least in my experience, like, you have to know when to go so you can duck all the traffic. Yeah, because it can take you 3 hours to go like 10 miles, which is, I'm pretty sure parts of my soul that got eaten during such journeys have not grown back. I used to live up near there, actually. I grew up in the Mojave Desert. I'm not a beach kid. My move to Los Angeles didn't happen until I was in my 20s. Yeah. So, like, I grew up in the Palmdale, Lancaster area. Yeah, it's a nice little place. Oh man, how are we doing down there? Yeah, it's pretty cool. I love Germans. Yes, ich Klumpner. Okay. Let me make a note of that so I can go back. Palmdale? Yeah, it is. I'm in Orange County right now, which is still cheaper than LA. Yeah, please. Go take care of it. I'll just chat with, the rest of the fine folks here. Yes, go save the chick. Oh, man. Oh, thank you. Yes, German was a language I was trying to learn for a while, so, I mean, I don't have a fantastic handle on it, but the accent I'm okay at. So I can make it passable. I worked, Anna Mocikat, the author of Behind Blue Eyes, is German, and she was telling me that at the very least I can make myself at least sound Swiss, and I'm like, you know what? Good enough. That's a native German-speaking country. I'll take it. Oh yeah? Whereabouts in the Mojave then? You spent time there when you were in the Marine Corps? Oh God, being from New England, yeah, I could imagine that was jarring, going from snow to just straight up desert. It is a very loud language. 29 Palms. Okay, I don't know if I've been out there. Ja, Deutsch ist sehr laut. Eine lange sehr laut. Eine sehr laute lange. Yeah, I forgot. In German, they actually have the adjectives come first. In some languages, it's the reverse of English, which I'm sure most or all of you know, where it's, yeah. Oh, it's a Marine base, okay. I'm gonna wait for Sarah to save the chick. So would I. Yeah, and then we'll do the one more chapter and we'll be good. "15 different countries. What have been some of the highlights of traveling that extensively?" I bet, yeah. Seeing all the different cultures in different countries is fascinating. It really is. Like, I remember, the only other country I've been to besides here is Japan. But it was absolutely fascinating to see it happen. To just see everything there. Oh, were you stationed there in Okinawa then? How did you like that? We're just waiting for Sarah to finish her brave mission to save a small chick. Let's Well, the editors will edit out the portions of quiet, but how's everyone liking the story so far? Let's start there. Oh, Carrie, you were on an army base in Panama? That's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's such a cool country. There's so much. Oh, no worries. There were 3 chicks. Did you save all the chicks, Sarah? Are they okay? Are they okay? Good, I'm very glad. All right.
Okay. Chapter 6, last one for the night.
And then I'm gonna go outside for a walk. Okay. It would help, by the way, and you can watch my tech tips on TikTok. I posted the latest one. Did you know that pressing an on switch allows you to record things? Arming the track for recording makes it record, because if that last moment was anything to go by, I sure the hell didn't. Okay. Chapter 6. Breaking the Ice. Akrab paced the sands until he absolutely could not wait any longer, and twisted back to the first realm, fully ready to kill anyone who stood in his way. The helicopter, to his relief, had moved on. The sun had partially risen in his absence, though trees were down on all sides, almost as if a tornado had hit. Further, all around him the wind was screaming in the branches, slapping at the spruce boughs, creaking as trees rubbed against each other. It was also warmer now, above freezing. Akrab's heart stopped, however, when he saw that the moss around his magus had been disturbed. Not only that, but she carried 2 new holes in her belly and chest, each oozing a tiny trickle of blood. Blood that she could not afford to lose. "Mandib!" he cried, dropping to his knees beside her. He laid his palms over her newest wounds and pulled the scraps of silver free. He sealed the flesh with the rub of a thumb, then put a hand on her neck, felt for a pulse. At first, he found none. Akrab, however, had had 3,000 years to learn the quirks of a Fury's existence. When wounded past the ability to fight, they slowed, their bodies relaxing until their breaths could come at days apart, or centuries. As long as they still had the blood of Furies within their veins, they could continue to live in a form of stasis until they received help, or healed. Or their enemies finished the job. To quarter the body or to cut off the head was the easiest way to drain a Fury of her power. But these fools, thinking she was a wolf, blessedly hadn't known that. It took an eternity, long minutes of holding his breath, praying to every god Akrab knew as the wind flailed at the trees above him, before he felt his magus's slow, languid heartbeat, a single thump beneath his fingers. He was so relieved he bent his face to her forehead and touched her brow with his. "Mondib," he whispered to her pale, sleep-slackened face. "You are one lucky little wolf." With that, he hauled her from the bloodied mosses and tossed her over his shoulder, grunting at her weight, even after hauling her through the Fourth Lands. Akrab still hadn't grown accustomed to the heaviness of the Third Lander she carried in her veins. He headed northeast at a lope, staying well away from the main waterway of the Yentna River. He had seen the boats, without roads or highways in the Alaskan bush. He knew their enemies would be using the water in lieu of pavement. That and the iron monsters of the sky. He was still unnerved that they had seen him in the half-realm,
That, according to everything he knew, should be impossible. He ran from morning until nightfall, skirting creeks and waterways, walking as far and as fast as he could while the winds continued to thrash the trees around him, knocking the occasional spruce or birch from its shallow root system, sending it crashing to the ground in a cacophony of snapping limbs and whipping branches. Sometime around noon it began to rain. A fast, sideways, biting rain that felt like a hail of cold needles jabbing him in the skin. Akrab had always hated the rain. He shuddered as the first droplets hit his head and shoulders, draining the Fourthlander magics from his body as they oozed their way down his arms and chest to leave steaming violet puddles on the ground in his passage. Normally he would have simply twisted to the half-realm, or even better, disappeared to the Firelands completely. But with his mistress barely clinging to life on his back, he had to endure. By nightfall the winds had died, but Akrab simply could not take the slimy, cold, filthy feel of the water any longer. After much searching, he ducked under a pocket carved out beneath the roots of a fallen cottonwood tree, and dragged the Magus in after him. While cramped, it was a blessed relief from the exhausting, energy-draining tug of water against his skin. "You survive all that, Mondeeb?" he asked, touching her neck once more. Though she had not stirred at all throughout the rainstorm, despite the fact he'd closed her wounds, was not a good sign. It seemed to take centuries to feel her heartbeat, and Akrab could not be sure, but it almost seemed as if she was slipping further into stasis. Had he missed a wound? Frowning, Akrab stretched her out in the muddied clay in front of him, and summoned a flame upon his palm so that he could see her. His heart stopped. Where her lips had been blue before, now they were white. "Mondeeb," he growled, rolling her over and pushing aside her icy-cold sweater to locate a wound she'd taken just below the right breast. "You need to tell me these things." He had not found it earlier because the bullet had made a clean... The bullet made a clean exit, but that exhale sure as hell didn't. Jeez. I think I need to run my air filter in here. There must be a lot of dust. He had not found it earlier because the bullet had made a clean exit, its entry and exit points hidden by the curve of her breast and the strap of her bra. The flow of blood so slowed that throughout the day only a pink spot had appeared upon her sweater on either side of her torso. He winced, seeing that, wondering how much of the blood of fury still resided in her veins. With her this drained, those two tiny pink spots were precious. What was worse, she was cold. Her hands, her face, her neck, all of it was as ice. And her fingers. They were tight curls of bone, refusing to be pried outward, as stiff as a corpse. That convinced him. "You will hate me for this, Mondeeb. You will hate me for this, Mondeeb." I need to growl that more. "You will hate me for this, Mondeeb," he growled, closing his fist over the flame. "But I am running out of options." A Fury couldn't die of frostbite alone, but a Fury who had been shot, her lifeblood lost due to an enemy's wound, might. He set a tiny stick afire and lodged it into the half-frozen clay nearby, giving him enough light to see by. Still, he hesitated. To physically undress her. Such was, for a Fury, an act of war. Yet wrapped in icy wet cloth, her lips white as death, she wasn't about to undress herself. Besides, she had to be the one to declare that war. 3,000... Besides, she had been the one to declare that war 3,000 years earlier when she tried to chop off his head. All he had been doing had been enjoying a quiet day under the palms, sprawled out on a blanket, sucking on dates. Hiding in the First Lands, he now recalled, because he'd just suffered yet another colossal failure with the latest genie woman that had laughed and abandoned him after he couldn't consummate their union. He narrowed his eyes down at the Magus. Certain things, he decided, were going to be rectified, soon. Not while she slept, of course, but soon. He had spent too long without, and her perfect, slender body had taunted him for over 3 millennia. He wondered if she realized that was part of the agreement of truce. Probably not. She seemed quite certain that he was celibate, which was probably better for both of them, at least for now. For now, he would satisfy himself with holding her body against his own, pretending she slept in willing contentment instead of teetered on her deathbed. At least, he decided, she wouldn't be able to punish him with shadow when she woke. He now held that particularly distasteful ability, though he kept it as far from his awareness as possible. And while she still could, and would, certainly make his life miserable in other ways, he was free of tasting the poison of the First Lands in his system ever again. Besides, he had always wondered what the little wolf's body felt like, skin to skin. He would have to remove his sirwal, of course, since the silk may get in the way of the heat transference. An entire layer of silk. He shook his head. No, couldn't have that. His poor little wolf was much too cold for that. Perhaps it was with more eagerness than necessary that he found the hem of his mistress's prim, long-sleeved, turtle-necked sweater and pulled the muddy, sleet-crusted thing from her body. Doing the same with her boots and heavy denim pants, he hung each of them on a root above him, where they would dry from the heat of his body. Then he hesitated, debating over whether or not removing her bra and underwear were truly necessary. Necessary, no. Delightful? Yes. And thus, while that rational corner of his mind started babbling of wings of light and radiant swords, he stripped the last sodden articles of clothing from his mistress's body, then removed his sirwal. Then, spreading out on his back upon the frozen ground, as naked as he'd sprung from his mother's loins, Akrab pulled the little Magus up over his chest and wrapped his arms around her back. Immediately, his face twisted in distaste at the combined wetness and iciness of her body. There were few things in the world that he considered more repulsive than water and cold. The whole experience was not as enticing as he had expected. Much, in fact, like taking a man-sized tuna from a fishmonger's freezer and embracing it against his naked flesh. Removing his sirwal, he quickly realized, as disgusting droplets of water began melting down his skin and catching in the folds between his scrotum and his thighs, had further not been his wisest idea of the last 24 hours. Gritting his teeth with distaste, for a Jinni would rather smear himself in filth than wash with anything other than clean sand, he nonetheless continued to hold her. After an hour, the last water upon her body had evaporated as steam, and Akrab was able to consider the odd yet pleasant feel of a Firstlander woman's cool flesh against his own. He even allowed himself to relax, watching her. His Magus looked so much less bitter when unconscious. It was why he'd gotten caught so many times, on those sleepless nights he'd spent studying her in her sleep. She looked almost pleasant. Even white-lipped and pale as a corpse, she had a certain serenity about her. Something she never maintained in life. At least, not when she looked at him. Grimacing, Akrab busied himself with other thoughts. He began feeling along her thigh and leg, trying to locate the first 2 wounds the Inquisitors had given her. They weren't difficult to find. Each bore a solid lump of metal beneath the flesh, like a hard knot that ground against bone. The little fool. She'd sealed her wounds over the silver. Probably an act of desperation, then. He glanced at her face, knowing that she didn't have the strength to endure him slicing those wounds open, especially not with something as crude as a rock or a sharp stick. The wounds would doubtless continue to pain her, if her past run-ins with Inquisitors was any measure. Whatever silver leached into her muscles before she removed the bullets would continue to aggravate the Thirdlander for weeks or months beyond. Unfortunately, until she woke, his little angel of vengeance was stuck with them. Akrab frowned, realizing for the first time that his wolf no longer wore her pendant. Had the Inquisitors taken it? Then he winced, realizing that in the last 12 hours of being dangled over his shoulder, he might have lost it. And without her lord's token, she was going to have a more difficult time of directing her power. Remembering how long his Magus had worn that pendant, and how violently she had reacted the one time he had tried to touch it, Akrab decided that yes, it had undoubtedly been taken by the Inquisitors, which of course would make her that much more intent on bringing them all to their knees and chopping off their proffered heads. The silly, rash little beast. After the 3rd hour passed and Akrab saw no visible change in her condition, he decided he might be able to aid her progress somewhat. Focusing on her face, which had regained but a modicum of its color, he began to seep Fourthlander magic through their soul cord into her body. It wasn't much, but it might be able to help her begin rebuilding her fury.
"All right, little Magus,"
Akrab muttered, as Law began to strain at his senses in warning.
"That's all I can do for you without a wish."
Indeed, if he were to drain any more that night, the lords of his land would probably come looking for him. Not, he thought unhappily, a place he wanted to be, as his father would be amongst them, and the last thing he wanted to do was explain to his sire why he was giving out free boons to a heartless little wench that had tried to chop off his head, and would happily do so again the moment she had her sword.
Warmth of the mother.
But he was tired of the gods meddling in his affairs. The miserable dick-lickers that they were probably watching him from their thrones, drinking date wine and being fed the fruit of pomegranates by 1,000 luscious virgins, laughing at the stupid Jinni who had unwittingly twisted his own words into a curse. A fury. The goddess be merciful he was being forced to celibacy or settle for a fury. Him, a Jinni, with no alternative but a hot-tempered, utterly unreasonable, brash, uncompassionate, violent, arrogant, holier-than-thou fury. Angel of vengeance, death from the skies, handmaiden of war, warrior priestess of Horus, great justice of the pact who had slain thousands with a simple swipe of her sword, while he, the humble, non-murderous sand singer of the Scorpion clan, a creature who loved to sing and dance and twine his legs in union, suffered the constant threat of her misplaced wrath. Someday he would seek out the god responsible and wish a pox upon his balls. Until then, Akrab thought, peeking down at the sleeping fury, he would have to make do. Swimming from the haze of sleep, Kashifa eventually became conscious of a near uncomfortable warmth seeping into her from below. Groaning, she opened her eyes.
"Now, before you do anything rash,"
a voice from beneath her said,
"I was only trying to warn you."
Oh wow, I went for longer than I realized. Nice.
"I was only trying to warn you, Mondib."
She felt him move then, as if to gently lever her away, and realized in horror that their skin had contacted. Down there. Kashifa screamed and scrambled away from the Jinni, slamming into the wall of what looked like hell with her hips and back. Roots clawed at her like fingers from the underworld, scraping at her spine and shoulders, and a rain of earth sprinkled down her neck and shoulders. "Akrab!" she cried, her heart hammering. "What have you done?" His violet eyes anxious in the darkness, Akrab said,
"Calm yourself, Mondib. I only warmed your flesh, nothing more."
He had warmed her flesh. She felt her stomach churn. For a Jinni who wove his words like thread, there were 1,000 meanings for such a phrase. "Did you?" she began, but couldn't finish. She looked away, feeling bile biting at the back of her throat. He started to sit up, reaching for her.
"Probably not the most brilliant or comfortable thing I've ever done."
"Stay down!" she snarled, and she could have sworn she felt her fury uncoiling within. Akrab must have seen that she was about to loose the wolf, for the Jinni hesitated. Slowly he lowered himself on an elbow, not disobeying but not quite following her commands either. Looking wary, he said, "You were on the verge of silence!" She was so angry she couldn't breathe. Her whole body was shaking with the feel of his filth touching her in her sleep. "Speak again, and I will find out what Jinni tastes like." Instead of making a lewd retort, Akrab went silent, watching her with the wariness of a leopard facing a lion. When she could find words again, Kashifa managed, "Did you?" Her throat, however, clenched before she could finish her question, and she looked away before he saw her tears. She tried again, forcing the words from her lips, only to be stopped before she could make her meaning clear. "Did you spear?" Such a simple word, yet so impossible to force from her tongue. It took 3 more times before she gave up, beating a fist into the dirt wall beside her in wretched misery.
"I did not pierce you, Mondib."
The Jinni's voice was gentle. She swiveled to face him, startled. He had risen to a cross-legged position, looking as if he wanted to reach for her again. A certain agony was playing across his face, one which Kashifa did not understand. "You didn't?"
"I did not spear you while you slept, or any other time. You simply slept your wounds away in my arms, Mondib."
Jin could not lie. Kashifa let out a relieved breath that came out as a wretched, nervous laugh. Wiping tears from her face, she quickly looked away so that the Jinni could not see the remnants of her fear. After all, a Fury feared no man, and was frightened of all men, for on his person every man carried that which could unmake a Fury, a tool that could cast her from the sisterhood forever. An act that Akrab liked to taunt her with at every waking opportunity, gloating over the hardness of his flesh, the ways it could be put to use, the pleasures gained from it, and on his more vulgar days describing the act itself in every repugnant detail, as if his tiny brain could think of nothing else. And he hadn't done it. Why hadn't he done it? It made no sense to her. After 3,000 years, surely he had come to realize that the moment she gained her wings would be the same moment he finally lost his head. He'd had her at his mercy, utterly helpless to stop him. He could have taken her wings forever, and irrevocably saved his neck from her sword. What kind of fool wouldn't have snatched that opportunity when it was given? Then she remembered the conversation before the blood pact, and she saw the Jinni in a whole new light. "You couldn't bed me," she stammered, stunned. "Your curse." The Jinni's face twisted.
"I am incapable of bedding women," he muttered in reluctant agreement. "You were safe in my arms."
"Safe!" she blurted, looking down at herself in disgust. "I was naked! You defiled me, you monster!" The Jinni snorted and yanked her sweater from a root above his head. He tossed it to her.
"Defiled, then."
He cocked his head at her and grinned with an impish intent that she recognized as his lecherous nature once more crawling to the surface. "Would you like for me to sing you a song about another such defilement to ease your mind?" He yanked her undergarments and jeans from their similar hangers and threw them at her. "As I've told you before," Kashifa snapped, tugging the blood-stained garments gratefully over her nakedness. "I hear you sing one more of those body disgraces, and I'll douse you so deep in shadow you won't feel your tongue for a week." The Jinni cocked his head and gave her a long, hard look. Too late, Kashifa realized she didn't have the shadows to use against him anymore. Her breath caught, and she suddenly felt her face heating.
"I am a bard amongst my people. Actually, a rather famous sand singer. I've memorized thousands of songs in my lifetime. Can recount for you hundreds of ballads of heroes, love, and folklore. How many of those have you heard me sing, Mondib?" "Too many. You've let me begin 4 that I can remember. I never got more than halfway before you stopped me threatening your poisons." 4 was actually more than she would have guessed. She could only remember 2. And both times the Jinni had looked shattered when she'd stopped him. Shaking herself out of a sudden pang of guilt, she demanded, "When did this become a conversation about my wrongdoings to you? You just had me spread out naked upon your body, you despicable ogre!" "True. And you forced me to spend every night alone, singing myself to sleep amidst the dunes, for the last 3,000 years. Kashifa glared. "Because I kept catching you spying on me in my sleep. Because you aren't a hot-headed, ill-tempered kibba when you're asleep."
That needs to be a bellow. Prepare for a bellow, everybody. Good thing I have that compressor going. It makes it so much easier to yell without blowing people's ears out.
And blowing my mic out.
"Because you aren't a hot-headed, ill-tempered kibba when you're asleep," he bellowed back. "It's a pleasant change to see you sleeping. Forgive me for alarming you. If you weren't so damned agitated all the time, hells, if maybe you'd let me sing you to sleep, I wouldn't have needed that reassurance. You're like one of those small Northlander dogs, Mondib. Small and restless and ready to piss on everything under the sun. Learn to relax, and life will treat you better." She narrowed her eyes at him, still stunned by his original insult. "I am not a kip. Mondib! After 3 millennia, I beg to differ." The casual way he said it stunned her. "You actually think of me as such?" she blurted, utterly disbelieving the sincerity in his face. He peered at her, his violet eyes curious. "After 3,000 years of you dousing me in shadow for the most minor infractions? Of you telling me I'm impure? That I'm filthy on merit of my birth? That I'm corrupting you with my touch, my eyes, my voice, my smell?" He cocked his head at her. "Did you really think I thought any differently?" The knowledge dismayed her. In 3,000 years, for better or worse, Akrab had been her constant companion. He knew her better than even her sisters before her fall. He knew every little aspect of her, from how much she needed to eat, to how long she slept, to when her yearly menses would start. Even going so far as to bring her teas to ease the pain. And he thought she was a bitch. "I am not a kibba. And put on your sirwal. You disgust me with the sight of your flesh." Too late she realized what she had said, so automatic was her response to the sight of his filth. Still naked, Akrab raised a brow. Making no movement to reach for his wad of silk, he said, "Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps you could remind me of one moment, excluding the last 2 days, when you have given me a single kind word, a single boon or benevolence that was unasked for, a single gesture of gentleness towards me." She stared at him for so long she felt her jaw slide open. "Since when is it my job to be kind to a criminal?" she blurted. He shrugged. "We were debating whether or not you were a kibba, not the veracity of my alleged criminality." He cocked his head at her. "So, little wolf, can you think of anything?" And then, still refusing to put on his sirwal, he folded his arms over his chest and waited, cross-legged in that regal pose that the djinn had perfected, eyes flat with challenge. Spurred by the arrogant look he was giving her, Kashifa thought back to the last 3,000 years of her existence, scrabbling to find some fact to wrench from history and throw in his smug face to prove him wrong. And kept thinking. She scrambled to come up with some kind thing she had done for him, some benevolence to counter the outright surety in his face. At the increasing smugness of his visage, she blurted, "I offered you a share of my meal, outside the Ajanta caves."
She cocked her head at him in triumph. "As I recall, you refused." He gave her a long look. "As I recall, Mondib, the offering came with the words, 'Perhaps this will silence that twisted loom you call a tongue.' And you threw it at me. To eat it, I would have had to swallow sand." Kashifa felt her face flushing. She scrambled to think of something else. Everything she could come up with had been tainted with her frustration, her despair. Yet ever since her fateful meeting with the Jinni at Tuffalat, her life had been a living hell of anxiety and hopelessness. She in fact could not think of a time when she had been kind to him. For centuries, all she had wanted, at times more than life itself, was for him to disappear, to twist back to the Firelands, never to return. She could remember no gift, no concession, no sympathetic words that she had ever given to him, under the constant threat of his goading words, his mocking jibes, his verbal abuse. "You were taunting me! You spent 3,000 years taunting me! Of course I was not kind to you!" For a long moment he said nothing, only watched her over his massive crossed arms. "I taunted you, little wolf, because you refused to see me as anything other than a beast to whom you had the misfortune of being chained." "Dennis, now!" Utterly placid, he said, "You sit there. Call me a beast to my face, after I have twice rescued you from the brink of death these last 2 days, as well as countless times before that. And you somehow find it incomprehensible that I in turn find you to be a kibba." She felt her face heating. "The only reason you saved me is because you don't want to be tied to a bag of bones. You've said as much 1,000 times already." The Jinni scanned her face impassively for several minutes. "I saved you, Mondib, because I still harbor the hope, minuscule that it has become considering its wretched and chronic failure in the past, that I may one day teach you how to love." Kashifa's heart shuddered, and she reflexively reached for her lord's pendant. When her fingers came back empty, she froze. "It was missing when I undressed you. I suspect the Inquisitors had a chance to take it. They'd shot you and disturbed the debris I'd piled around you." Kashifa felt a wretched moan escape her lips. The thought of an Inquisitor holding her lord's talisman was too much to bear. "No," she whimpered. "No," whispered, not whimpered. "No," she whispered through a throat that suddenly no longer wanted to work. "I must have it back." "Is that your wish?" the Jinni said, giving her a sharp look. "No, damn you!" Kashifa snapped. Though her insides were screaming yes, her conduit to her lord, a connection she had maintained from the moment she'd been accepted by her sisters. Lost! She lowered her head to compose herself before her gut could wrench control of her tongue and give the Jinni his final wish, and in doing so his freedom. Now, feeling the nakedness of her bare neck more than anything else in her life, she wanted to make that wish. Slowly she took a shuddering breath, touched by a man's filth, and losing her pendant to the Inquisition in one day. She'd never felt so thoroughly depressed in her life. She avoided looking at the deeper blackness of the Jinni's groin, which he had still refused to cover, and fought tears as she painstakingly studied the ragged root system twisting into the walls of whatever hole the Jinni had tucked them into, trying to regain control of her inner turmoil. "Where are we?" she finally managed, her eyes burning with loss. "Your guess is as good as mine, Mondib. I took us north and east, more east than north in places because I was avoiding the creeks. I couldn't cross them with you slung over my back. Water drains my strength, and with the third lander in your veins, you are heavy." She took a breath meant to stabilize her, but it came out as a sob. The Jinni had saved her, slung her, a fury, over his back, and carried her around like a sack of grain pilfered from an enemy's storehouse. It was yet another humiliation to shatter her this wretched day. and she felt as if she were desperately grabbing at dissolving wisps of herself, carried away by the horrors of the past 2 days. She'd lost her lord's symbol, the last thing that she had of being a fury, her entire being, everything she had once been, was now just a memory. She hunched inward as her shoulders began to quiver, trying to protect what was left. She didn't realize the Jinni had slid toward her until his hot arm slipped tentatively around her shoulders, and he pulled her tenderly to his chest. "We'll get it back, Mondeep." And so grateful was she to hear those words, to have another barrier between herself and the world that had stripped her bare. Kashifa simply nodded and let him hold her. Imelda shut off the television in disgust. Weather forecasters were backtracking, scrambling to make sense of the sudden appearance of one of the most violent Chinooks in Alaskan history, which was even then ripping pieces of the roof off of the local high school. The power had gone out 6 times in the last 3 hours, and the radio told her that the winds, while sudden, looked to be there to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. "Those winds," Jacques said, having paused in the common room long enough to catch the last of the broadcast. "They seem to have originated around Squentna." Imelda looked over her shoulder, giving her scout a guarded glance. The last thing she wanted was to give the highly pious man another reason to look at her as a chosen. She had enough trouble as it was organizing and operating the most multinational conglomeration of customs, languages, and nationalities in the North American section of the Order. A conglomeration that, she was sure, Inquisidora Zenaida had painstakingly pieced together for her from every spare loner, hothead, and misfit she could find. No, Imelda decided, she did not need an overly excitable Jacques babbling to every member of her team of angels and signs of God. As Inquisidora, she already had enough trouble gaining their trust. The last thing she needed was for Zenaida to catch wind of it and start whispers of false signs and grasps for power. "They started in the ocean, Jacques," she said, carefully laying the remote beside the television. "All Chinooks begin there." "I heard the forecaster say that they were rare at this time of the year," Jacques insisted, watching her closely. Imelda gave her scout a long look. He was still dressed in his black combat gear, ever ready to jump in a truck or onto a plane at a moment's notice. "It's more of a winter occurrence. It is rare to hear in the fall, and with such force." Jacques held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "Herr Drescher suggested you would need a driver to Eagle River, as he still cannot fly." Imelda winced, her eyes catching upon his all-black garb, knowing that it would not carry the inconspicuousness she needed. "Is Giuseppe unavailable?" "Monsieur Riso joins Herr Dresser in confession and penance, Inquisidora. He felt the..." I think that should be Inquisitrice. Monsieur Riso joins Herr Dresser in confession and penance, Inquisitrice. He felt he shared Herr Drescher's ardor and seeks forgiveness for the act. Imelda sighed. Such was typical of her Italian co-pilot and bodyguard. Pious to the point of disability, he not only repented for his own sins, but for those of the people around him. "Very well. Find something less striking to wear. I will meet you at the car in half an hour." Jacques bowed low. "As you command, Inquisitrice." Spinning, he strode off to his bedroom in the same long, loping stride that carried him silently through the forest when hunting the creatures invading their realm. 4 more pockets of them had been found to the north and west, before the winds had forced them to give up the search. Even now, over 30 bodies warmed the racks in the basement. So many that Zenaida had made an emergency call for another storage area to be built while they were sorted and interrogated. That the Segunda Inquisidora insisted on keeping them alive
when it would be so much easier, and safer considering the capabilities of some of their charges, to kill them now and complete their sacred mission to God, rankled Imelda. She did not sign on with the order so that she could watch sentient creatures writhe upon the rack as they were bled for their powers, beasts and demons though they were. Her mission was to cleanse the realm, not to sully it with the spread of their magics. Even if they were used by the proper hands of the Church, it felt wrong. And, if her padre's assertions were correct, that was exactly what Imelda was destined to do. Purify the order, remove the last of the creature's taint from its ranks. After all, while it may have been necessary to fight the demons' magic with their own powers, back when their corruption reigned and the world was a horrifying place of death and darkness, the Church had been well on its way to finally winning the battle for centuries. That this final pocket in Alaska was proving to be so thickly populated, unlike the claims of her fellow inquisitors that the beast's influence was spreading, only suggested to Imelda that they had gotten more desperate and were congregating en masse in the final lands still left available to them. They are running out of places to hide, Imelda thought, with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. Soon the realm would belong to God's true agents once more, and the monsters she fought generations from now would be a distant memory. When that happened, Imelda and her order would become obsolete. That was why she fought. She wanted that peace of God to reign, that surrender to truth to ease the hearts and minds of the people. She wanted the fear of demons and dragons and vampkin to fade with the last vestiges of her order, once the final beasts had been hunted and dispatched. She hated that Zenaida made it a production. Each Inquisition, she took great pride in it, carving the profanation from their flesh. It was an art to her, one she had been developing for several decades. Sometimes Imelda wondered if that was why the Order suffered a magus in their midst. While cruel and unnecessarily brutal, Zenaida was unparalleled at her ability to get even the most repugnant entities to repent, and in doing so wrenched more of their magics from their bodies than any other Inquisitor before they were put to rest. Still ruminating on that, Imelda met Jacot in the garage early, while he still wore a black t-shirt. And, while he still wore a black t-shirt, she was satisfied to see he at least wore a baseball cap and dirtied blue jeans. "You know where we're going?" she asked, climbing into the back seat. Looking at her through the rearview mirror, Jacot said, "Herr Drescher said you wish to consult your padre, Mamie." Imelda nodded. "And you know where he lives?" "Les montagnes," Jacot replied, making an impatient gesture. "Island Road, at the edge of Eagle River." She motioned for him to start the car. Usually she landed at the large mountain meadow outside Padre Vega's retirement home up in the winding South Fork area off of Highland Road. But with the winds being as they were, she would have to settle with a drive. As soon as they backed out of the garage, Imelda understood why Herr Drescher had refused to fly. Rain whipped sideways across their windshield, buffeting the car in bursts as they pulled up the long driveway to the winding narrow road leading back to the highway. On other days, Imelda would have had Jacot take a right rather than a left, and would have spent a few hours praying by the serene glacial blue waters of Eklunta Lake. Eklunta Lake. Eklunta. And would have spent a few hours praying by the serene glacial blue waters of Eklunta Lake. Today, however, she needed an answer to the words that had hounded her ever since she'd seen one of God's messengers in all of her glory. Our sister of vengeance. What did it mean? Surely a symbol that she was on the right path. But vengeance against whom? Against the Lord's enemies? Were there others the angel wanted her to vanquish? The trip down the Glen Highway had the tinted windowed SUV weaving with every gust of the wind, and several times Imelda saw Jacot's face harden with concentration as he fought to keep the vehicle on the road. Small dead leaves blew across the highway in sodden gusts, all the same bland orange and yellow color, for this wretchedly cold land could support none of the maple or oak that gave the rest of the United States its fiery glow in the last months of fall. The drive up Highland Road and to the home of Padre Vega was even more frightening. In the mountains, the winds were stronger and more violent, and more than once the car was buffeted at a steep drop-off where nothing stood between the car and the hillside below but air. When Jacques finally brought the SUV to a halt in the unassuming driveway of the small one-story tin-roofed home, more a cabin than a house, Imelda was happy to get out of the car. As soon as she opened the door, however, she almost lost it to the wind. She had to hold her breath and duck out into the rain unprotected, for an umbrella at that point was simply useless. Padre Vega stood on the wooden porch of his small house, shielded by the eaves and the wall of his house, giving her a sympathetic look as she held an old magazine over her head and raced to the door, fighting the strange impulse to stop breathing as the wind sucked her breath away.
You look tired, sister,
her padre said, ushering her inside and hastily shutting the door against the gale behind them. Long night, Imelda admitted, reverting to Spanish.
How has retirement treated you, Father?
Father Vega gave that humble grin she so loved and said,
Well, up until the frost killed them, I was enjoying my pea garden. Alaska can grow some wonderful peas.
Imelda allowed herself to share his smile. Somehow her padre was the only person she'd ever known who could make her relax just by his very presence.
Gardening has treated you well, then?
Oh, very much so, Father Vega said, smiling.
As has fishing. And golf?
Imelda frowned. Alaska has a golf course? Somehow she had never considered this land of wilderness, grizzly bears, and demons to maintain a decent green.
Several of them. I use the one up near Arctic Valley. Less hassle than driving to Wasilla.
He gestured to the two couches occupying the front room as he moved to the kitchen.
Sit. What will you have? Tea? Coffee? Soda?
She sighed and slumped into her favorite chair.
Coffee, Father. I'm running on 3 hours of sleep and my head is killing me.
Father Vega hesitated at the counter, giving her an anxious look.
They work you too hard,
he ventured.
Has your new medicine helped?
As he spoke, he retrieved one of his Thomas Jefferson mugs from a cabinet and poured her a cup. Imelda scoffed, even then seeing the fuzzy shards of glass at the edges of her vision, almost like a trillion tiny wormy strings forever eating at the corners of her mind.
No more than the last. This doctor insisted I change my diet. Says they're probably being caused by a reaction to something I'm eating. Hence why no one has caught it yet. I have an appointment next week to test for food allergies.
Her padre gave her a hopeful look.
That sounds promising.
Imelda snorted.
I've heard enough doctors assure me of so many cures now that I'm not about to get my hopes up. Whatever their diagnosis, I must keep moving on with my life or it would cripple me.
Her father gave her a sympathetic look. Gently, he offered,
I pray you unravel the case of your pain, sister. No one should be made to suffer so.
Imelda waved his statement off dismissively and took the mug of coffee he offered her.
After 3 decades, I've grown used to it. Nowadays, with the medicine, it's an inconvenience, nothing more.
She twisted the mug in her hand to peer at the writing on its back. Her padre was famous for his Jefferson mugs. He'd collected them since he'd taken his robes. Imelda examined the quote out of habit.
A little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical,
she repeated, turning the cup to read the words. Father Vega, a stalwart lover of Jefferson, smiled.
Quite a rabble-rouser, that one.
Imelda grunted and glanced at his cup. Father Vega held it out for her.
The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants,
she read when he twisted it so she could see. Meeting his soft brown eyes, she said,
You know, Father, there are those of the order who might frown upon your fascination with the man. Genius that he was.
Father Vega chuckled.
Then it's good you're not one of them.
The fact that her padre collected the sayings of Jefferson was a quirk of Father Vega's that left her inwardly anxious that it might be taken as idolation by those who didn't know him. But Imelda held her tongue. They'd had this argument too many times, and she was too tired to press matters today. Finishing her coffee with a sigh, she slumped into her chair and looked up at the spackled ceiling.
Father Vega, having known her since she was a child, having moved to Alaska to continue to act as her priest and confidant when he had no duty to do so, waited in silence, allowing her to collect her thoughts. Imelda listened to the wail of the wind outside, then finally just shook her head. Perhaps it's simply the lack of sleep, but I'm at a loss, Father. Father Vega watched her over his cup. How so, sister? Imelda tried to think of a gentle way to tell him that she had been at the epicenter of the Chinook that had mysteriously touched down outside Squentna before spreading to the rest of the Matsu Valley, but finally just blurted out, I saw an angel, Father. She came to me as I was putting a bullet to a demon's head. She called me her sister of vengeance, and she ignited the winds that even now thrash the valley. Father Vega cocked his head slightly. A demon, you say? It was a particularly loathsome creature, then. A murderer of innocence. Imelda grimaced. Her head was still pounding over that particular enigma. This one was quiet. There were no reports of death by her hands. In fact, aside from the fact that she was there when we came for the Phoenix, there were no reports of her at all. She seems to carry a genie with her, though I've never gotten close enough to get more than a few seconds' look. It is a mountain of a thing, with skin the blackest ebony and command of the fires of hell itself. Then, remembering the pendant, she tugged it from her breast pocket and handed it to him. The wolf had this on her body. It grew hot enough to burn while the visage of our Lord's messenger was before me. Father Vega took the symbol gingerly, frowning at it. I've seen a symbol before. So have I. We thought that it was the talisman that she was using to control the genie, but when I tried to summon it, nothing happened. Her padre frowned up at her, his soft brown eyes anxious in his weathered face. You say it burned in the presence of an angel, sister. Possibly a reaction of the evil within, Imelda suggested, then shrugged. I have no idea what it is. I've studied every book on symbology I could find in the library and nothing matches. Whatever it is old. Her padre is old. Her padre frowned up at her, his soft brown eyes anxious in his way. Her padre flipped it several times in his hands, examining the object from front to back. Do you mind if I hold on to it for a while? I do have a knack for research. Imelda made a dismissive gesture. Do as you will. I've already had it tested. It carries no link to a genie, and seems to have no magic emanating from it, so it is safe. Father Vega nodded and laid it aside upon the coffee table near his elbow. Now, this angel you saw, he spoke to you. He said, Our sister of vengeance. And before you ask, I can find no saint known by that title. The phrase itself had not a single result in Google. Father Vega frowned, looking down at his coffee mug in contemplation. Have you done anything out of the ordinary lately, sister? Out of the ordinary. Have you done anything out of the ordinary? Ordinary. There it is. Have you done anything out of the ordinary lately, sister? Imelda laughed. You mean aside from capture a phoenix and chase a genie through the woods on infrared? Two creatures that are supposedly long extinct. Her padre turned to give her a considering look. Did you catch the genie? She made a disgusted sound. This kind can slip realms like Zenaida changes clothes. Father Vega tisked and made a commiserating sound. She is still bothering you, isn't she? She's a bitch! She tortures those beasts we catch instead of simply killing them as our mission dictates. Even now, Zenaida was probably in the basement of the compound, working her talents on the latest of their acquisitions. Imelda hadn't seen hide nor hair of the woman since returning to Ikluntna. Then, gaining control of herself, she bowed her head and rubbed her fingers. Then, gaining control of herself, she bowed her head and rubbed her finger around the lip of her coffee mug. "Forgive me, Father. The woman vexes me." As she should. As she should. It is not our Lord's wish that our order torture innocents in his name. Imelda gave him a sharp look, having felt the same way for many years, but never having heard another say it aloud. Yet the order allows it. Father Vega lowered his head in obvious pain. It has the precedent of history, my dear. A precedent that I'm supposed to change, Imelda said blatantly. The first time she had so outwardly spoken of his visions. Father Vega glanced at her, his eyes sad. My dear, not even the holy matron can rescind an order of the Pope. Imelda made a face, but looked out the window, watching the trees bow and sway in the mountain valley below. It is wrong. Their screaming keeps me up at night. The walls are supposed to be soundproof, but I swear I hear it anyway. Father Vega listened in silence. Half the time, as I'm lying in my bed, listening to the sounds from below, I have an urge to go down there and kill them all. Put them out of their misery. That is what we're supposed to be doing, isn't it? Removing the evil from the lands. Before I took my vows, I never dreamed the depth of what we do. Certain aspects of it I find repulsive. Which is why you take the field in the service of our Lord, while Inquisitor Zenaida sits in her dungeon surrounded by her toys, happily reaping magic from the doomed in the name of God. It was one of the closest things to blasphemy that Imelda had heard from her padre's lips, but she did not care. Instead, she swiveled on him, slamming her cup against the coffee table. Why does the order allow it? A witch in our midst! It's obscene! Too late, she realized that Father Vega himself could be labeled a witch if the truth were known. In his humble way, he said softly, Sometimes, Imelda, a soul must be judged by its actions and not its nature. I'm sorry. I never meant... And I wasn't talking of myself, Father Vega said, lifting his hand. It is a code to live by, not a statement of my own innocence. Just consider that when you look at Zenaida and her position in the Order, there are those who would say she's necessary, that her endowments allow the Order to better complete its mission, that her cause is just and therefore pardons her spirit of his poor birth. There are others, like you and I, who look at her endowments and then see the depraved creature beneath. It is not her nature that you should find repulsive, Imelda. It is her actions. Imelda frowned at her padre, wondering if all the time alone to reminisce had treated him poorly. Father, surely you realize the blasphemy of what you just said. Father Vega shrugged. It is what it is. It took me many years, but I learned it is best not to judge a soul by its skin. Imelda cocked her head at him, half unsure she understood what he meant. Half of what I hunt is based off of his skin, Padre. He gave her an amused look. So it is? Imelda stared at him. Father Vega had spent 50 successful years doing as she now did, hunting those beasts and demons that had invaded the sanctity of their Lord's realm. That he would question the directives of the Order left her stunned. That he would say as much to an inquisitor left her utterly staggered. And with the humbling realization, he trusted her implicitly. After all, with a single word, she could have him join the beasts on the rack, even without her knowledge of his ability to see. I trust you, Imelda, her padre said, confirming her assumption with a warm smile. There are no secrets between us. And yes, I believe that the Order has been rotting from the inside. Clearing her throat uncomfortably, she turned to once again face the window. Dare I ask how long it has been deteriorating thus? Since its conception. Imelda flinched and gave him another hard look. And I am to enact changes. You've seen it? Oh, yes. Yes, you will, my dear. Imelda thought of her Star Dancer flashlight, of the Feylord-powered helicopters, of the Feystone goblets and elemental-fueled camp stoves. Immediately the glassy tendrils creeping through her brain started to lance her vision again, and she winced. It would not be easy. To remove the demon-powered artifacts from the Order would draw great opposition. But those of the truly faithful, like Jacot, would drop to their knees in relief. One of the first things I'll do, she said softly, still looking out the window. She said softly, still looking out the window. You stop the torture. Zenaida and her like can find other things to do than interrogate those who have nothing left to say. She had seen the hopelessness on their faces, the utter defeat. It was why she no longer visited the basement aside to deliver a new detainee. She couldn't stand the misery. You walk a dangerous path, sister. There are those who will not see you enact those changes. Once I am a holy matron, they will not be able to argue. He gave her a warm smile. Perhaps? He sighed and set his coffee mug aside. It is certainly not a task I would choose for myself. Then his easy, peaceful grin was once more in place, and he said, However we poor humans stumble in our attempts to serve our Lord, the Fates will right it in the end. The Fates! Imelda snorted and shook her head. You spend too much time studying your history and not your Bible, Father. Her padre only smiled at her. Ah, but in the annals of history lie the keys to the future. She raised an eyebrow at him. Then that is the source of your sight. You read the past to guess the future. Not guess, Father Vega said gently. Then before she could pry deeper, he changed the subject by taking her mug. More coffee? Please, she said, watching him get up to refill her glass. Then, as he poured, would it be a mark against my soul if I were to go into the basement tonight and kill them all?
No, wait, that's Imelda. Would it be a mark?
Would it be a mark against my soul if I were to go into the basement tonight and kill them all, before Zenaida has a chance at them? Father Vega hesitated at the pot, the carafe hovering over the mug. Instead of finishing to pour the coffee, he set the carafe down and looked up at her, his soft eyes troubled. If I were given the choice, Imelda, I would never kill again. And you won't. That's why you retired. He stared down at the carafe on the counter. I retired for many reasons, most of which have already come up this evening. Seeming to shake himself, he once again picked up the carafe and continued pouring. So tell me of this angel that visited you. Do you think it was a sign? It was an angel, Father. Her padre looked up at her with a sad smile. And again you judge a soul by its skin. The rest of her visit with her padre left Imelda discomfited, and by the time she returned to the SUV where Jacot waited in the driver's seat, blaring French rock over the speaker system, she was troubled. Either her padre was going senile, which at 78 wasn't a difficult thing to envision, or he held many beliefs he'd never confided to her until now. Many blasphemous things. He was of the proper age to be losing his wits, but something told Imelda that the old man, her lifetime confidant, was opening up to her in a way he had never allowed himself in her younger days, and that tonight had been a way of testing the waters, to see how much he could tell her without her bringing the order down upon its...
to see how much he could tell her, without her bringing the order down upon his head, which in itself was disturbing. Jaco, she muttered, slamming the door of the SUV behind her. Her driver turned in his seat to give her a concerned frown. The talk with your père did not go well, Mummy? Imelda shook off her ill-at-ease feeling and said, Padre Vega is getting old, Jaco. Her scout gave her a look of sympathy. When he passes, he will find the arms of our Lord, Mummy. Would he? Imelda suddenly had a pang of doubt. The old padre had always been quirky and outspoken in his liberal ideas, but because he had always advocated tolerance, Imelda had written it off as one of the unavoidable faults of human nature. But after tonight, after questioning the presence of an angel as a messenger of their Lord, Imelda was not so sure. Just take me home, Jaco, she said, rubbing her temples, trying to ease the ever-present pain in her head. I find I need my sleep. She said, rubbing her temples, trying to ease the ever-present pain in her head.
Okay, there it is. Alrighty, and that will bring us to the conclusion of a 4-hour cold read. Isn't that cool? Damn near 4 hours, anyway.
Iklutna. Oh, Iklutna. Oh my gosh, I was seeing an N where there wasn't one. Goodness. Oh man, I would love to, but I gotta switch to another project tonight. I've got another I'm juggling like 3 SBT projects right now. It's nutty. I'm doing the soundtrack for Behind Blue Eyes. We just got the music back for that. It's gonna be so good. I'm doing that. I'm recording a lit RPG series, and I'm doing this. This is fun. This is like day off narration for me. I love these stories. I'm like, okay, cool. I can just vibe with this story for 4 hours today. Oh, I have no doubt. Actually, that's perfect then that we stopped here, because then we can have a fun chapter, a challenge of 7 days next week. I will. I kind of like these weekly installments. It's like last time on Alaskan Fury, coming next Saturday. It's kind of fun. It did not feel like 4 hours, no. It's very easy to get into the zone with these, so it did not feel like 4 hours. Man, that was good, though. That was real good. Thank you. Alrighty. Well, to everyone that stopped by for the evening, you, of course, are always a welcome sight. Pleasure to talk to. Oh, which one? The one scene had me... Oh, God, yeah. That's fun. I love accent switching. Like, when it goes smooth, it's a lot of fun. It's like, you get to jump around between multiple personalities. Which scene are you talking about, Sarah? The scene where she thinks that he took advantage of her? Because that was intense. That was intense as shit. That was something. Man. And I'm sure all of you here know this because I believe you're all regular viewers of... Oh, the bargain scene. That was so good. I loved that scene. Yeah, I loved the bargain scene. That was very well written. But I'm sure all of you know this. Keep an eye out for the next cold read. I believe we'll be doing one more of this, maybe two. And then we'll switch over to the Discord reads for the remainder. And we'll just keep going until we are all finished up. The beach theme was good too, yeah. And then I'm just turning in some last minute, like the polishers just need a couple corrections from me for the stuff they've done so far. That's proceeding very fast. So keep an eye out for the full release. And then because we're progressing with this one the way that we are, this shall follow hot on the heels. So we will be... Okay, cool. I thought you meant like for whatever reason, I thought you were talking about the scene in the forest where he was hiding her under the branches. Yeah, so... Yeah, it's gonna be good. It'll be killer. That one's me, Jeff, and Emma. Jeff has the small appearance as Thunderbird, and then it's me and Emma for the rest of the book. This one I think is me, Emma, and Annie, because Annie is Imelda and Zenaida. So, we will be, good. Thank you so much for entrusting me with your words. It's, the biggest part of what makes this amazing is your writing, and the fact that I even get to do this at all. So, yeah. I will see you all around next week. Oh, excellent. Excellent. Oh, you'll get to hear my placeholder of Thunderbird. Yeah, if I do the cold read for him. Anyway, everybody, take care of yourselves. Thank you for stopping by, and I shall see you all next week. Good night now.